This book tells the true story of a young girl whose voice became one of the most recognizable in the world. Written with honesty and emotional clarity, it is considered the most widely read book ever created by a child. Nothing in its pages is invented. Every thought, fear, and hope comes directly from lived experience. The diary records a short but intense stretch of life spent in hiding, revealing the inner world of a bright, observant, and deeply sensitive girl as she grows up under extraordinary pressure. The author was born into a Jewish family in Germany and spent her early childhood surrounded by ordinary routines, school, and family life. When persecution against Jews intensified, her parents were forced to leave their homeland and seek safety in the Netherlands. In Amsterdam, she quickly adapted, attended school, earned excellent marks, and made many friends. She dreamed about the future with the natural confidence of youth. All of this changed when the occupying forces arrived, and the freedoms she had taken for granted began to disappear one by one. The diary opens with a moment of joy. The young girl describes waking early on her birthday, too excited to sleep, but forced to wait patiently until morning truly began. She greets the family cat, then joins her parents and unwraps her presents. Among flowers, small gifts, sweets, books, and toys, one object stands out above all others: the diary itself. From the very beginning, she treats it not as an object, but as a companion. She writes with warmth and delight about school celebrations, classmates, teachers, and the simple happiness of being surrounded by people who care for her. Her tone is playful, affectionate, and full of life. Soon, the diary becomes more than a record of pleasant events. It becomes a place where she can think aloud. She explains that keeping a diary feels strange, not only because she has never done so before, but because she doubts anyone would ever care about the thoughts of a young schoolgirl. Yet she feels an urgent need to write, to release what weighs on her heart. She reflects on the idea that paper is more patient than people because it never interrupts, judges, or grows tired of listening. Writing offers her relief in moments of sadness, boredom, and confusion. Although she is surrounded by family, classmates, and acquaintances, she feels deeply lonely. She explains this contradiction with remarkable clarity. She has loving parents, a sister, relatives, and many people who call themselves friends. She receives attention and admiration, especially from boys, and lives in a comfortable home. Yet none of this fills the absence she feels inside. She longs for one true friend, someone she can trust completely, someone with whom she can share her inner thoughts rather than polite conversation. This absence becomes the reason the diary exists at all. To make this imagined friendship real, she gives the diary a name. From that moment on, she writes as if speaking to a close companion who listens without judgment. She explains that before sharing her thoughts, she must first tell the story of her life so that this friend will understand her fully. She describes her parents' marriage, the birth of her sister, and her own arrival a few years later. As a Jewish family, they were eventually forced to leave Germany and rebuild their lives in the Netherlands. Her father became deeply involved in his work, while the family tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Despite their efforts, the shadow of persecution followed them. Relatives were affected by harsh racial laws, and some were forced to flee overseas. Her grandmother came to live with them, bringing comfort and familiarity during uncertain times. Then everything changed. War reached the Netherlands, and occupation followed. With it came a growing list of restrictions aimed solely at Jewish people. Step by step, everyday freedoms vanished. They were required to wear identifying symbols. They lost the right to use public transport, to ride bicycles, or to travel freely. Shopping was limited to specific hours and specific stores. Curfews were imposed. Visits, social gatherings, and evenings outdoors were forbidden. Entertainment disappeared from their lives as theaters, cinemas, and sports facilities became inaccessible. Even simple physical activity was restricted. Jewish children were barred from non-Jewish homes and forced into separate schools. These rules didn't arrive at once, but gradually, each new one tightening the boundaries of daily life. Fear became constant. Her friends worried that any action might unknowingly break a rule. Freedom shrank until it barely existed, though at first life still seemed bearable. Amid these hardships, the girl mourns the loss of her grandmother, expressing quiet grief and enduring love. She recalls her education, beginning in a Montessori school and continuing until Jewish students were transferred elsewhere. She remembers teachers fondly, especially one from whom she parted with tears. Eventually, both she and her sister were sent to a Jewish secondary school, marking another clear separation from the world they once knew. The diary closes this early section with a simple statement of the present. For now, the family is still together. Life is restricted but continuing. The young girl stands at the edge of events she cannot yet foresee, writing with honesty, intelligence, and a voice that feels startlingly alive. Through her words, the reader does not merely learn about history, but enters the private thoughts of a child trying to understand a world that is slowly closing in around her.
Then, everything changed. War reached the Netherlands, and occupation followed. With it came a growing list of restrictions aimed solely at Jewish people. Step by step, everyday freedoms vanished. They were required to wear identifying symbols. They lost the right to use public transport, to ride bicycles, or to travel freely. Shopping was limited to specific hours and specific stores. Curfews were imposed. Visits, social gatherings, and evenings outdoors were forbidden. Entertainment disappeared from their lives as theaters, cinemas, and sports facilities became inaccessible. Even simple physical activity was restricted. Jewish children were barred from non-Jewish homes and forced into separate schools. These rules did not arrive all at once, but gradually, each new one tightening the boundaries of daily life. Fear became constant. Her friends worried that any action might unknowingly break a rule. Freedom shrank until it barely existed, though at first life still seemed bearable. Amid these hardships, the girl mourns the loss of her grandmother, expressing quiet grief and enduring love. She recalls her education, beginning in a Montessori school and continuing until Jewish students were transferred elsewhere. She remembers teachers fondly, especially one from whom she parted with tears. Eventually, both she and her sister were sent to a Jewish secondary school, marking another clear separation from the world they once knew. The diary closes this early section with a simple statement of the present. For now, the family is still together. Life is restricted but continuing. The young girl stands at the edge of events she cannot yet foresee, writing with honesty, intelligence, and a voice that feels startlingly alive. Through her words, the reader does not merely learn about history, but enters the private thoughts of a child trying to understand a world that is slowly closing in around her.
Dear Kitty becomes, in these pages, more than a greeting. She is a quiet listener to moments of calm, irritation, pride, and youthful excitement. The girl writes during an afternoon of rare peace, when the house is empty and silence feels comforting rather than threatening. Her sister is out with friends, her parents have stepped away, and the world briefly allows her to breathe. She fills this stillness with small observations about her days, especially her growing fondness for playing table tennis. The game has become a lively social ritual, often ending with a shared walk to pastry shops that are still open to Jewish customers.
Ice cream, laughter, and chance generosity from familiar faces turn these outings into moments of carefree indulgence. Money rarely matters because there always seems to be someone willing to offer a treat, as though sweetness itself is an act of quiet defiance. She writes with amused self-awareness about something she considers both ridiculous and unavoidable: the attention of boys. Though she sees herself as far too young for such things, she admits that at school this problem seems impossible to escape. A simple bicycle ride home can turn into a declaration of affection, usually intense and short-lived. She describes these episodes with humor and confidence, explaining how she gently but firmly avoids encouragement. When admiration turns persistent or foolish, she finds clever ways to redirect the situation, often leaving the admirer confused while she pedals on, already absorbed in another topic. More intrusive behavior earns an immediate and decisive response. She refuses to tolerate it, stepping away without hesitation. Through this, she establishes her boundaries with clarity and self-respect, closing her letter with the feeling that a true friendship with Kitty has now been properly begun. Soon after, her thoughts turn to school, where tension hangs over the classroom as students wait for decisions about who will advance and who will not. The uncertainty becomes a kind of game for some, complete with loud arguments and reckless bets. She and her closest friends watch the spectacle with laughter, convinced of their own success despite lingering doubt about mathematics. She reflects sharply on her classmates, judging some as hopeless and others as undeservedly confident, while placing her faith, cautiously, in teachers who may or may not choose wisely.
Her relationship with her teachers is mostly good, though one elderly mathematics instructor becomes a recurring figure in her story. He grows irritated by her constant talking and eventually assigns her a punishment in the form of an essay about excessive chatter. Rather than feeling ashamed, she treats the task as a creative challenge. She argues cleverly that talking is a natural trait, especially for girls, and that heredity leaves her little chance of reform. The result amuses her teacher, but not enough to end the matter. A second punishment follows, then a third, increasingly absurd. When her creativity seems exhausted, a friend helps her transform the assignment into a poem. The story they invent is darkly humorous, exaggerated, and impossible to ignore. This time, the teacher accepts the joke, shares it aloud, and never punishes her again. From then on, her chatter becomes a shared source of humor rather than conflict. As summer heat presses down on the city, her frustration grows. Walking everywhere under the sun reminds her how much freedom has been taken away. Public transport, once ordinary, now feels like a lost luxury. A long walk to the dentist leaves her exhausted, and she falls asleep in class afterward. Yet even in this discomfort, she notices kindness. A nurse offers her a drink. A ferry captain allows passage without question. She reflects thoughtfully that ordinary people are not to blame for the suffering imposed on her community. She longs for the school term to end. Her bicycle has been stolen, another loss added to the growing list of restrictions, but vacation is close, and that thought sustains her. In the middle of this weary routine, something unexpectedly pleasant happens. A boy she met briefly before calls her name near the bicycle shelter. He introduces himself shyly and offers to walk with her. She agrees without ceremony, and they begin talking easily. He is older, full of stories, and attentive without being overwhelming. Soon he waits for her again, and their companionship becomes a small but bright part of her days. Their friendship deepens quickly. He tells her about his life, about living apart from his parents, about a former girlfriend he found unbearably dull, and about how meeting Anne woke him from boredom. She recounts this with dry humor, aware of how strange it is to be described as a remedy against sleep. When a planned visit falls through, he calls instead, asking if they can talk outside. She prepares herself carefully, waits by the window, and notices her own calm when he finally arrives. Their walk becomes a confession. He speaks openly about family disapproval, about expectations placed upon him, about choosing his own feelings over obedience. She listens, cautious but honest, warning him not to act behind his grandparents' backs. He responds with a phrase that lingers, insisting that affection cannot be forced. As they walk, she notices another boy greet her for the first time in ages, a small moment that unexpectedly delights her. By the time they part, plans for another meeting are already made. Throughout these pages, the voice remains unmistakable. It is intelligent, playful, observant, and quietly brave. In the middle of restriction and fear, she writes about laughter, school punishments, summer heat, and first companionships. Without realizing it, she preserves the fragile normalcy of a young life, capturing moments that feel light on the surface but carry the weight of a world that is steadily narrowing around her.
Dear Kitty follows Anne through days that feel balanced between ordinary teenage excitement and a growing, unspoken tension. She writes first about a visit that should have been simple and pleasant. Harry comes to her home to meet her parents, and she does her best to play the role of a polite hostess, serving cake, sweets, tea, and biscuits. Everything looks proper and respectable, yet neither she nor Harry feels comfortable sitting quietly under adult supervision. Relief comes when they step outside together. They return later than expected, and her father's anger is sharp and immediate, not because of disobedience alone, but because being outside after evening hours has become dangerous for Jews. Anne understands this at once and promises to be home earlier in the future, accepting the rule even as it disappoints her. She mentions, with a touch of defiance, that she is invited to Harry's home next. Friends tease her endlessly, but she insists she is not in love. In her mind, friendship with boys is natural and harmless, and she repeats her mother's belief that having a companion is nothing to be ashamed of. Still, stories reach her ears. A friend tells her how Harry reacted angrily when questioned about whom he preferred, and how he admitted privately that Anne mattered to him, demanding secrecy. Anne recognizes what this means. Harry is clearly in love, and for once, she does not find this uncomfortable. On the contrary, she enjoys it. Her sister would describe him as pleasant and well-mannered, and Anne quietly agrees, adding that he seems even more than that. Her parents approve of him, praising his manners and kindness, and Anne feels glad that harmony exists all around. She notes with mild irony that Harry finds her girlfriends childish, and she cannot entirely disagree. Soon, her thoughts shift to school. The distribution of report cards takes place in a Jewish theater, and the result satisfies her. There is one poor mark in algebra, but the rest are solid and respectable. Her parents react differently from most. They care little for grades themselves and focus instead on her health, her happiness, and her spirit. If those are intact, they believe everything else will find its place. Anne, however, feels a strong need to prove herself. She knows she was accepted into her school under special conditions and wants to justify the trust placed in her. Her sister's results are, as always, outstanding, and Anne admires her deeply, recognizing her intelligence without envy. At home, the atmosphere is changing. Her father spends more time there now, no longer fully occupied with work. Anne senses how strange it must feel to become unnecessary in one's own profession. Other men have taken over his responsibilities, and during a walk together, he speaks openly about the possibility of going into hiding. His words are calm but heavy. He explains that the family has been preparing for this quietly for a long time, storing clothes, food, and furniture elsewhere. They do not want their belongings seized, and even more, they do not want to be taken themselves. Anne is frightened by the seriousness of his tone and asks when this might happen. He tells her not to worry yet, urging her to enjoy her carefree life while she still can. She hopes desperately that these dark plans will remain only words for a long time. When she writes again, everything has changed. It feels to her as though years have passed in a handful of days. Events have unfolded so quickly that the world seems turned upside down. She begins by stating the most important fact: she is still alive. Where and how she lives now is impossible to explain without going back to the moment it all began. One afternoon, a summons arrives. At first, she does not hear the bell, lying lazily in the sun with a book. Her sister appears, pale and shaken, whispering that an official notice has arrived. In Anne's mind, terrifying images rise immediately. She thinks of camps and punishment cells and the helplessness of losing her father. Her sister insists he will not go, explaining that her mother has already gone to consult a trusted friend. The plan to move into hiding, discussed before only in theory, must be carried out immediately. Silence fills the room, heavy and suffocating. They wait, unable to speak, overwhelmed by fear, heat, and uncertainty. When the bell rings again, Anne assumes it is Harry, but she is told not to open the door. Instead, voices downstairs reveal that her mother has returned. Later, Anne learns the truth. The summons was not for her father, but for her sister. The realization is almost worse. Her sister is so young, and yet she too is being called away. Tears come uncontrollably, but relief follows when it becomes clear that she will not go. This is the moment their parents had prepared for. The decision is final. Anne's thoughts race. She wonders where the hiding place might be, in the city or beyond it, in a house or somewhere less comfortable. She does not ask these questions aloud. Instead, she and her sister begin packing what they can carry. Anne's first choice is her diary. She adds small personal items, letters, and objects filled with memory, stuffing her bag with things that might seem foolish but feel essential. Clothes matter less to her than reminders of the life she is leaving behind. The hours pass in a blur of quiet movement and whispered arrangements. Trusted helpers come and go, taking away clothes and necessities in bags and pockets. The house grows strangely still. No one can eat. The heat lingers. A lodger remains longer than expected, forcing the family to pretend that nothing unusual is happening. Late in the evening, more helpers arrive, and more belongings disappear into the night. Exhausted, Anne falls asleep quickly, even knowing it is the last time she will lie in her own bed. She wakes before dawn. Rain falls softly, easing the heat. The family dresses in layers upon layers, not for warmth, but to carry as much clothing as possible without suitcases. Leaving with luggage would be unthinkable. Anne feels suffocated by fabric, but does not complain. Her sister leaves first, her school bag heavy with books. Anne still does not know where they are going. When it is time for her to leave, she says goodbye only to the family cat, trusting that it will be cared for by neighbors. The kitchen remains as it was, breakfast untouched, beds unmade. Everything suggests a sudden departure, but appearances no longer matter. What matters is escape, survival, and reaching their destination safely. Anne ends her account here, promising to continue, suspended between the life she has lost and the unknown that awaits her. She writes to Kitty as rain pours down and the streets blur before her eyes. She walks between her parents, each of them carrying an ordinary school bag or shopping bag, filled far beyond what it should hold. People heading to work glance at them with a kind of helpless sympathy. Their faces show pity mixed with embarrassment, as if they wish they could offer help, but already know it is impossible. The yellow star stitched to their clothing explains everything without a single word being spoken. Only once they are fully outside do her parents begin to reveal the plan in fragments. For months, they have quietly removed furniture and personal belongings from their home, preparing to disappear. The move had been planned for later, but a sudden summons forces everything to happen sooner, leaving them with rooms that are not fully arranged and a future that feels rushed and fragile. The hiding place is in the same building where her father once worked, a fact that seems simple only on the surface. Few people there know the truth, only the most trusted helpers, while others in the building remain unaware. She carefully describes the structure, moving through her memory as though guiding the reader step by step. There is the warehouse below, the offices above, and beyond them a hidden world that no outsider would ever suspect. Behind an unremarkable gray door lies a maze of rooms, stairs, and narrow passages, forming what she calls the back house.
It is cramped, uneven, and damp, yet it offers something priceless: concealment. When they finally arrive, they lock the door behind them and are alone at last. Her sister has already reached the hiding place and waits for them. Every room is overflowing with boxes, bedding, and supplies collected over many months. There is hardly space to move, let alone sleep. Her mother and sister collapse onto bare beds, drained beyond words, while she and her father begin working immediately, driven by a restless need to make the place livable. They unpack, clean, scrub, and arrange until exhaustion claims them. No warm meal passes their lips that day. Work matters more than hunger. Days blur together in constant motion. Food is brought secretly by helpers using ration coupons. Windows are darkened with makeshift coverings. Floors are scrubbed again and again. Only after several days does she finally stop long enough to understand what has happened. Her old life has ended, replaced by silence, secrecy, and waiting. Writing to Kitty becomes the first moment when the reality truly sinks in. At night, she listens to the steady chime of a nearby church tower marking the passage of time. Others find it unsettling, but she finds comfort in it, especially in the dark. The hiding place does not yet feel like home. It feels more like a strange boarding house where she is staying temporarily, though she knows this stay has no clear end. She decorates her small room with pictures and postcards saved from before, transforming bare walls into something warmer and more familiar. Even small acts of creativity feel like quiet victories. Fear is a constant companion. They speak softly during the day so the workers below will not hear them. Curtains are stitched together from mismatched scraps and pinned in place, never to be removed. Coughing at night is forbidden, even when illness makes it nearly impossible to suppress. The radio is listened to in hushed tension, every sound feeling dangerous. Silence itself becomes oppressive, especially after dark, when imagination fills the empty spaces with terror. She longs for more people, more voices, anything to break the stillness. When the other family finally arrives, the house feels fuller and somehow more alive. Their arrival brings stories from the outside world, rumors and laughter. The adults invent clever explanations for their disappearance, spreading tales of secret escapes and distant journeys. Friends and neighbors begin to believe whatever version suits their imagination best. Some picture bicycles at dawn, others military vehicles in the night. The truth, hidden behind a bookshelf and locked doors, remains far stranger and far more fragile. As time passes, the hiding place becomes more secure. A rotating bookcase is built to conceal the entrance, turning their refuge into a true secret annex. Bumps on foreheads and bruises testify to how difficult it is to move quietly through such a space. Adjustments are made, padding added, habits learned. Life settles into a routine shaped by confinement. She does not study much at first, granting herself a brief mental escape before lessons resume under her father's guidance. Daily life is filled with small conflicts, irritations, and moments of boredom. Tempers clash, patience wears thin. She observes the others with sharp honesty, especially the boy her own age, whom she finds dull and uninteresting. Yet even these annoyances are proof of life continuing, however strangely. Outside, the weather is warm and bright, and though they cannot step into the open world, they find ways to feel the sun through an attic window. In these moments, lying quietly beneath the light, she holds on to a fragile sense of normalcy. Writing to Kitty, she captures fear, frustration, humor, and hope all at once, preserving her inner world while the outer one remains forbidden.
She confides to Kitty that life in the hiding place has begun to feel tighter, not because of walls or doors, but because of people. A fierce quarrel erupts between the Van Daan couple, louder and harsher than anything she has ever witnessed at home. Her own parents would never shout at one another like that, and the contrast unsettles her. The cause of the argument is trivial, hardly worth repeating, yet it explodes with a force that fills every corner of the house. What troubles her most is Peter, caught helplessly between his parents.
No one takes him seriously. He drifts through the days, soft, slow, and anxious, constantly convinced that something is wrong with his body. One day he panics because his tongue looks blue. The next he wraps his neck in a scarf and complains of pains everywhere. To her, he seems like a true hypochondriac, living in fear of imagined illnesses. Tension simmers not only between husband and wife, but also among the women. Her mother and Mrs. Van Daan clash in quieter, sharper ways. Small acts turn into silent battles. Mrs. Van Daan removes her own sheets from the shared cupboard, leaving only a few behind, fully expecting that her neighbor's linen will serve everyone. The decision is not returned with open protest, only with a quiet imitation. There are similar struggles over dishes. Mrs. Van Daan insists on using her own service, guards it jealously, and resents every accident. When a soup plate shatters in Anne's hands, the reaction is swift and dramatic. The house feels heavy with offended pride and wounded tempers. Her mother lectures her often, long speeches that make her feel misunderstood and small. Only her father remains a steady refuge, patient even when he is briefly annoyed. One brief disturbance breaks the monotony in an almost comical way. A book meant for adults becomes the center of secret schemes and punishment. Curiosity pulls Peter toward it like a magnet. He sneaks away to the attic whenever he can, devouring its forbidden pages until he is caught in the act. What follows is shouting, slapping, and banishment to the attic without supper. The family sits down to eat in an uneasy calm when a shrill whistle echoes through the chimney, Peter's defiant voice declaring that he will not come down. The moment teeters between absurdity and danger. In the end, authority wins, resentment lingers, and for days the air is thick with silence. Then, as always, life slides back into routine. As weeks pass, Anne grows increasingly aware of how closely everyone watches her. Mrs. Van Daan criticizes her endlessly, especially for talking too much. Even small household habits become weapons. Pots are left unwashed with scraps of food inside, later dumped on her sister to clean, all accompanied by sharp remarks. In contrast, time spent with her father tracing family history feels calm and absorbing, each story offering a link to a world that once felt secure. Books arrive secretly through kind hands, and reading becomes a refuge. Stories of girls and summer adventures make her laugh aloud, a rare release in a place where laughter must usually be swallowed. Lessons begin again. She works diligently, memorizing languages and verbs, determined not to fall behind. Radios bring distant voices and news from beyond the walls, reminders that history continues to move even while they stand still. Yet discussions at home leave her wounded. She hears herself described as foolish, unprepared, not yet developed enough to read certain books or understand serious subjects. Comparisons with her older sister sting deeply. She resolves to study harder, not only to learn, but to prove herself. Practical worries creep in as well. She realizes how few warm clothes she has, and how impossible it is to retrieve what was left behind. Making something with her own hands becomes both necessity and comfort. Still, privacy is fragile. When Mrs. Van Daan nearly catches her writing, fear shoots through her. The diary holds truths that would wound if read aloud. Evenings sometimes bring uneasy friendliness. Shared snacks and quiet talk soften edges for a moment. Anne speaks honestly about Peter, about how his affection makes her uncomfortable. The adults listen, half hopeful, half amused. Meanwhile, the men devise clever ways to send word to trusted friends outside, using detours and disguises that feel like scenes from an adventure story, though the stakes are painfully real. Arguments with her mother grow frequently. Anne feels misunderstood, closer in spirit to friends she cannot see than to the people beside her every day. Discussions drift toward a future after the war, toward fairness and dignity, especially for those often dismissed. Yet daily life keeps circling back to discipline and obedience. Mrs. Van Daan cannot resist correcting her at meals, urging her to eat foods she dislikes, accusing her of being spoiled. Anne refuses politely, again and again, until the tension bursts. Words fly, sharp and humiliating, comparing her to an imaginary daughter who would behave better.
Silence follows, heavy and absolute. Then her father speaks, calm but firm, defending her with a quiet strength that cuts through the room. His words end the argument completely. Victory is small, but it matters. Anne observes the flush of anger on Mrs. Von Dahn's face and feels a guilty spark of satisfaction. In this confined world, such moments are rare affirmations of self. She closes her letter knowing that life in hiding is not only a battle against fear outside, but also a daily struggle to remain oneself within walls that press closer with every passing day.
She writes to Kitty in a mood sharpened by constant irritation, feeling once again how strange it is that adults quarrel so easily and so often over matters that seem utterly insignificant. She had always believed that arguing was a childish habit, something people outgrew with age, yet here it flourishes daily, louder and more persistent than anything she remembers from before. What pains her most is not the noise itself, but the way her own name is dragged into almost every dispute. Discussions, as the adults prefer to call them, circle endlessly around her behavior, her character, her manners, examined from every angle and judged without mercy. Not a single good quality seems to survive these conversations. She is expected to swallow sharp words and raised voices with a pleasant smile, as though endurance alone were a virtue. This, she knows, she cannot do. She refuses to let insults pile it endlessly, telling herself that she is not as insignificant as they seem to think, and that one day she will speak plainly enough to make them turn their attention to their own conduct. What shocks her most is the sheer lack of courtesy and, in her view, the foolishness behind it. She knows she has faults, she admits them freely, but she also knows that the accusations hurled at her are exaggerated far beyond reason. At times, her anger boils so fiercely that she feels it must eventually burst, no matter how hard she tries to restrain it. Amid this tension, a dinner conversation unexpectedly becomes a small stage for philosophy and pride. The subject drifts toward her father's modest nature, a quality so obvious that even the most stubborn person could not deny it. This sparks a declaration from Mrs. Van Daan, who insists that she herself is extremely modest, far more so than her husband. The claim, in its very boldness, seems to contradict itself. Her husband responds calmly that he has no desire to be modest, having learned from life that those who push themselves forward achieve far more than those who shrink back. He even advises Anne not to be modest if she wishes to succeed. Her mother quietly agrees, but Mrs. Van Daan cannot resist adding her own judgment, criticizing what she calls a strange modern approach to raising a child. She contrasts it with her own youth, certain that things were different then, and implies that this family's ideas are misguided. As tempers rise, Mrs. Van Daan grows flushed with excitement, while Anne's mother remains composed. Anne observes with interest how those who redden with emotion often lose their arguments more quickly. Her mother responds thoughtfully, explaining that a little lack of modesty can be healthy, that it is possible to stand one's ground without arrogance. This only deepens the misunderstanding. Mrs. Van Daan demands to know how she could ever be considered anything but modest, insisting that if she did not look after herself, no one would, and she would be left to starve. Her mother can do nothing but laugh at this dramatic defense, which provokes a torrent of mixed language expressions, so tangled and theatrical that the speaker finally rises to leave in indignation. At that moment, Anne, absorbed in the scene, shakes her head unconsciously, half sympathetic and half amused. This small gesture ignites a shrill outburst, so exaggerated and coarse that Anne cannot help finding it ridiculous. Watching this, she reaches a firm conclusion. You only truly come to know someone after you have quarreled with them in earnest. Life in hiding produces not only arguments but strange practical arrangements. Without a proper bathroom, bathing becomes a carefully organized ritual. Warm water is available in certain parts of the building, so everyone claims a different spot according to comfort and modesty. Peter chooses the kitchen, announcing solemnly that no one may pass through while he washes, trusting this request to be sufficient protection. His father prefers the privacy of an upstairs room, even though it means carrying heavy water. Mrs. Van Daan delays her decision, waiting to see which place proves best. Anne's parents settle into their own routines, while Anne and her sister bathe together in the front office, drawing the curtains and washing in near darkness, one peeking outside at passers-by while the other takes her turn. Eventually, Anne grows dissatisfied and, inspired by Peter, moves her basin into a spacious toilet where she can lock the door, turn on the light, and enjoy rare solitude. To her surprise, this becomes the most pleasant bathing place of all. A visit from a plumber turns daily life into an exercise in endurance. The water must not be used, and even the toilet is forbidden. Improvised solutions appear, including a large glass jar pressed into service. What bothers Anne less than the inconvenience is the order to sit absolutely still and silent for long stretches of time. Whispering is already the norm, but complete stillness tests her patience beyond measure. After days of this, her body aches from immobility, relieved only by evening exercises. Fear returns suddenly one evening when a loud bell rings. Her heart leaps with terror until others suggest harmless explanations. Silence remains essential, especially with unfamiliar workers moving through the building below, people who know its layout too well for comfort. Even so, there are moments of celebration. Mrs. Van Daan's birthday brings flowers, small gifts, and better food than usual. Yet Anne is irritated by Mrs. Van Daan's attempts to flirt with her father, touching him and seeking his attention. Anne's jealousy flares, and she confronts her directly, pointing out that her own mother behaves nothing like that. Laughter briefly breaks the tension when Peter and Anne disguise themselves in each other's clothes, provoking genuine amusement from the adults. New skirts arrive for the girls, shockingly expensive and poorly made, a reminder of how much the world outside has changed. There is also good news. Lessons in shorthand are ordered, and Anne feels hopeful, convinced that learning such a secret script could be invaluable. Still, emotional storms continue. Another clash with her mother leaves both of them in tears. In the heat of pain and frustration, Anne admits that she feels closer to her father, a confession that troubles him as he assures her that such feelings will pass. She is not convinced. Speaking calmly to her mother requires effort she does not yet possess. She throws herself into studying, reading in a foreign language, clinging to learning as one of the few certainties left. In these crowded rooms, she is discovering that hiding is not only a matter of walls and silence, but of navigating love, anger, and identity under constant pressure.
She writes to Kitty with a heart weighed down by fear and grief, aware that the world beyond their hiding place is growing darker by the day. Familiar Jewish families are being taken away in groups, removed without mercy, and packed into freight wagons like animals. They're sent to camps where conditions are whispered about in horrified tones, places where washing facilities are scarce, where there is little privacy or dignity, and where men, women, and children are forced to sleep together in chaos. Escape from such places seems impossible. Shaved heads and worn faces mark people forever, making hiding nearly futile. Anne wonders how life could be even worse in the distant, brutal places to which many are later sent. Rumors reach them through secret radio broadcasts, speaking of people being killed in vast numbers, of death delivered by machines designed for efficiency. The thought chills her. The stories shared by those who help them are no less terrifying. One helper describes an elderly, disabled Jewish woman waiting helplessly outside a door for officers to return with a vehicle to take her away, trembling as gunfire cracks in the sky and searchlights sweep overhead. No one dares to pull her inside. Fear rules everything, and punishment is swift and merciless. The sadness spreads to those around Anne. Another helper worries constantly about her beloved, who has been ordered to leave for forced labor. Planes thunder overhead night after night, and jokes meant to ease the fear fall flat.
Trains full of young men depart daily, some attempting desperate escapes during brief stops, with only a few managing to vanish into uncertainty. Anne writes of yet another horror, the practice of taking innocent hostages. Respected citizens are seized and held, their lives balanced against acts of resistance they did not commit. When no culprit is found, the innocent are executed and their deaths dismissed as accidents. She struggles with the cruelty of it all, with the bitter knowledge that she once belonged to the nation now responsible for such acts, though that bond has long been torn away. She feels the depth of the hatred that now divides peoples who once lived side by side. Despite the crushing weight of these thoughts, daily life continues in its strange enclosed rhythm. Anne throws herself into schoolwork, translating chapters from foreign novels, memorizing new words, wrestling with grammar that feels deliberately designed to torment her. Some assignments frustrate even her father, and when both of them are stuck, her sister is called in to help. In shorthand, however, Anne feels proud of herself, certain she is advancing fastest. She devours books, forming strong opinions about writers, already imagining passing her favorites on to her own children someday. Relations at home improve for a while. Laughter returns when she and her sister squeeze together in one narrow bed, whispering and laughing until the walls seem less close. They speak about diaries, about the future, about dreams that remain carefully guarded. Anne notices small things too, like her own reflection, wondering how others truly see her, unsure whether compliments are sincere or merely polite. Fear strikes again when unexpected noises echo near their hidden door. A worker arrives without warning to service equipment in the building, and every sound becomes a threat. Anne's imagination transforms him into a monstrous figure, ready to uncover their secret. For long minutes, terror grips her so tightly she can barely breathe. Relief floods in only when it becomes clear that the danger has passed, that the hidden door remains undiscovered. Such moments leave her shaken long after the immediate fear fades. There are also rare nights of comfort, friends who risk everything to help them stay over, filling the secret rooms with warmth, conversation, and better food than usual. Even then, danger lurks. A sudden electrical failure plunges them into darkness, forcing quiet bravery as repairs are made by candlelight. When morning comes, rain pours outside, and the helpers leave again, stepping back into a world that feels impossibly far away from the silent attic. Worry returns when her father falls ill. Fever and a rash appear, and there is no doctor to call. They can only wait, hoping rest will be enough. News arrives that the home of the Van Daan family has been emptied, their possessions left behind. Anne knows better than to complain about what has been lost. Complaints change nothing. She reads more grown-up books now, encountering subjects that confuse and fascinate her, ideas about adulthood and womanhood that make her both curious and embarrassed. Her father reads her classical plays in the evenings, his voice steady and comforting. Her mother encourages prayer, but Anne feels distant from words that do not seem to answer her questions. Tension within the family surfaces again when her mother grows nervous and sharp. Anne feels singled out, as though every mistake lands on her shoulders while her sister is shielded. A simple argument over a book becomes a lesson in injustice. Anne gives in quickly, not out of anger but sadness, hurt that judgments are made without understanding. She accepts that her mother and sisters stand together, and she has grown numb to that. What wounds her more deeply is when her father, whom she adores above all others, seems to favor her sister too. His praise and affection, when directed elsewhere, stir a quiet ache she cannot silence. She does not envy her sister's intelligence or beauty. What she longs for is something different, a love that sees her fully, not just as a child to be guided, but as Anne herself. She clings to her father because he represents the last thread of warmth holding the family together in her heart. Yet even he avoids conversations that might ease her pain, especially when they touch upon her mother's faults. Anne feels she must become her own guide, her own comfort, shaping herself without the example she wishes she had. She imagines herself as a small boat, sailing alone, unsure where she will one day reach shore. Again and again she resolves to focus on her mother's good qualities, to seek within herself what she cannot find in others, but the effort exhausts her. She feels judged inconsistently, praised one day and dismissed the next, no longer a child to be indulged, yet not respected as someone with real thoughts and ideals. These feelings swell inside her, pressing for release, and always she returns to her diary. Kitty listens without interruption, offering the patience no one else seems to be able to give. Anne promises herself that she will endure, that she will follow her own path, swallowing her tears even when she longs for encouragement. She asks only to be accepted as someone who is overwhelmed, trying every day to become better, even when strength feels painfully scarce.
These entries capture a mixture of mundane life, careful planning, and the ever-present shadow of danger that dominates Anne's days. She begins with small, almost joyful moments, celebrating Peter's birthday, describing his gifts, and noting events in the wider world, such as Allied landings in North Africa and the ongoing battle at Stalingrad. Even in the midst of war, she registers these events with a blend of awe and cautious hope, noting Churchill's phrasing, the end of the beginning, and seeing in it a hint of optimism. Anne also shares the practical realities of life in hiding. She recounts how they manage food, carefully storing beans, lentils, and other essentials, and the mishaps that can turn a simple chore into a minor catastrophe, like when a sack of beans fell down the stairs, scattering across the floor. Even such small domestic accidents bring a mix of panic and laughter, providing brief relief from the tension surrounding them. She notes with relief that her father's illness has passed. The diary then turns to a significant development, the addition of a new resident, Mr. Albert Dussel. They carefully choose him and organize his arrival, ensuring secrecy and safety. Anne describes the nervousness, the instructions, and the eventual moment when Dussel enters the secret annex, marveling at its hidden nature and their clever ruse to protect themselves. She documents all the rules of the household, from quiet hours and meal times to hygiene, study, and even radio use, reflecting the careful structure required for survival. Anne's reflections reveal both the practical and emotional challenges of sharing the confined space with a stranger. She acknowledges her initial discomfort at Dussel using her things, but follows her father's principle. What matters is that we can save someone. The rest doesn't count. She observes Dussel's hesitancy and slow adjustment to life in hiding, and she patiently guides him, even as she notes the ongoing tension and need for vigilance. Amid all this, Anne is deeply conscious of the horrors outside the annex. Through Dussel's accounts, she learns the full scale of persecution, families being rounded up, marched to camps, beaten, and sometimes ransomed, but too often sent to death. The cruel arbitrariness of this terror, the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, children, all forced into a march toward death, leaves her shaken and guilty for her own safety. Yet she recognizes the necessity of maintaining some normalcy inside the annex, laughing and joking when she can, to avoid letting fear and despair dominate their small world. Finally, Anne reflects on her own isolation. Even the comfort of family and friends cannot fully replace her lost world. She experiences an emotional emptiness, a recognition that her father's love, though deep and steady, cannot fill every need. She is painfully aware of her vulnerability, of the weight of responsibility and fear, and yet also committed to resilience, holding fast to life, hope, and small joys, even while surrounded by the suffering of those outside. These passages show Anne's dual existence, a hidden world of careful routines, small joys, and new companions, set against the relentless reality of persecution and fear that stalks the world beyond their walls.
The darkness has become a heavy cloak over the secret rooms, draped by the sudden loss of artificial light. Because the residents exceeded their energy allowance, they are forced to endure long evenings in shadows, waiting for the sun to rise again. When the afternoon light fades into the gray of twilight, reading becomes impossible, and the small group is left to find comfort in the sound of their own voices. They whisper in foreign languages, recite old lessons, or stretch their limbs in the pitch black, trying to keep their spirits from sagging under the weight of the gloom. For a young girl with an observant eye, the darkness offers a different kind of freedom. She pulls the heavy curtains back just an inch, peering through a pair of binoculars at the world outside. Across the way, life continues in golden squares of lamplight, families eating dinner, a dentist tending to a nervous patient, and a man filming his loved ones. These glimpses of the ordinary feel like a theater performance, a reminder that the world still turns beyond the walls of their confinement. Living in such close quarters, however, turns every personality flaw into a source of friction. The arrival of a new resident, an elderly dentist who was once thought to be a lover of children, has brought a new kind of tension. He has revealed himself to be a stern, old-fashioned moralist who delivers endless lectures on proper behavior. Sharing a small room with him is a test of endurance, especially when his complaints find a sympathetic ear in the girl's mother. The household dynamics often feel like a gathering storm. One small correction from the dentist is followed by a sharp word from her mother until the atmosphere reaches the intensity of a hurricane. In the quiet of the night, the girl lies awake, her pillow often damp with tears of frustration. She feels caught between the person she is and the person the adults demand her to be, a tangle of emotions that she struggles to put into words on her dwindling supply of paper. Despite the friction, the calendar brings moments of shared tradition that pierce through the gloom. The winter holidays arrive nearly at once, blending ancient customs with local festivities. For the Jewish Festival of Lights, they make do with a wooden candle holder and a few precious minutes of flickering flames, singing songs in the half-light. But it is the celebration of the kind old saint that brings a true sense of wonder. A large basket, hidden in the shadows of the warehouse and adorned with festive paper, reveals surprises for everyone. There are dolls sewn by hand, clever poems, and small tokens of affection that make the residents forget, if only for an hour, that they are hiding from the world. In these moments, the secret annex feels less like a prison and more like a home, held together by the thin threads of ritual and the kindness of the friends who protect them from the outside. The kitchen becomes a stage for a different kind of spectacle when a delivery of meat arrives from the black market. One of the men, once a skilled butcher, takes charge with a bloody apron and a sense of professional pride. The rooms fill with the mechanical hum of a grinder and the pungent scent of spices as sausages are stuffed and hung from the ceiling. It is a chaotic scene. A woman tries to study a new language while stirring a simmering pot and nursing a bruised rib. A boy plays with his cat underfoot, and the dentist attempts a makeshift surgery on a reluctant patient. The dental procedure turns into a comedy of errors, with the patient shrieking in pain and the amateur dentist standing frozen as his tool remains in her mouth. Laughter, sharp and sudden, erupts among the onlookers, a necessary release for the tension that usually simmers beneath the surface of their daily lives. From her vantage point behind the curtains of the front office, the girl watches the world go by like a silent film. She sees people rushing through the rain, their heads tucked under umbrellas, and children with dirty faces playing in the streets. There is a profound sadness in her gaze as she watches Jewish people walking outside, feeling a strange sense of guilt that she is safe while they are exposed to the dangers of the street. The war is a constant presence in their thoughts, a revolving wheel that turns from the scarcity of food to the shifting front lines of the conflict. News from the outside is grim. Families are being torn apart, and children are begging for bread in the freezing cold. The girl reflects on the immense suffering of millions, feeling a mix of selfishness for her own relative safety and a deep, aching desire for the end of the catastrophe. The weight of being good in such a pressurized environment begins to feel like an impossible burden. The girl describes a feeling of being pricked by 1,000 arrows, each a criticism from the adults who find her too loud, too stubborn, or too selfish. She longs to scream, to stamp her feet, and to run away from the suffocating expectations of those around her. She tries to find a middle path, choosing silence over conflict, but the effort of suppressing her true nature is exhausting. She worries that she is using up all her reason and patience now, leaving nothing for the life she hopes to lead once the world is at peace again. Even as she struggles with her mother and the irritating habits of her roommates, she remains acutely aware of the historical drama unfolding around them, the hunger strikes of great leaders, the sale of the very building they inhabit, and the desperate calls for resistance echoing from the pulpits of the city. In this small, crowded world, every scrap of butter and every whispered word becomes a testament to their survival.
The nights in the annex have become a symphony of terror, where the roar of anti-aircraft guns is so deafening that human voices are swallowed by the thunder. During a sudden electrical short circuit, the darkness felt like a physical weight pressing in on the inhabitants until every nerve was frayed. The young girl, trembling with a feverish chill, found herself seeking the warmth and protection of her father's bed, a childish gesture born of a very adult fear. Even the older woman, who often speaks of fate with a stoic air, dissolved into tears, her voice a fragile reed against the booming artillery. When the sharp rattle of machine guns joined the chorus, the mother insisted on lighting a single candle, defending the girl's need for comfort against the father's stern pragmatism. In that flickering yellow light, the terrifying sounds of the war seemed just a little further away, though the house itself continued to shake with the force of the conflict. Beyond the threat from the skies, the house held its own smaller, more intimate terrors. Shadows on the ceiling were once mistaken for burglars, sending the household into a silent panic, only to reveal a colony of rats scurrying through the attic. These uninvited guests proved dangerous in their own right, as the boy discovered when he reached into the dark to fetch old newspapers and felt the sharp, painful bite of a cornered rodent on his hand. To counter these furry intruders, the office cat, a territorial creature nicknamed the German for its aggressive nature, was given free rein of the warehouse. The residents watched these domestic dramas with a mixture of amusement and exhaustion, finding distraction in the antics of the cats and the endless, repetitive meals of beans that have become a staple of their restricted diet. The outside world continued to bleed into their sanctuary through the crackle of the radio and the hushed reports from their protectors. Rumors of shifting alliances and the entry of new nations into the war brought fleeting moments of jubilation, followed by the crushing weight of disappointment when the news proved premature. The airwaves also carried the chilling voices of the enemy, broadcasting puppet shows of wounded soldiers who spoke of their injuries with a haunting, forced pride. Meanwhile, the economic net tightened as high-denomination banknotes were declared invalid, a calculated trap designed to flush out those living in the shadows or profiting from the black market. For those in hiding, every change in the law felt like a personal threat, a reminder of how fragile their safety really was. A night of true panic arrived when the sounds of a break-in echoed from the warehouse below. The men descended into the gloom, armed with nothing but a heavy hammer and their own courage, while the women waited in a suffocating silence, terrified even to use the plumbing for fear of being heard. The tension was so thick it seemed to sour the very air they breathed. When the men returned, pale and shaken, they speculated that the intruders had fled upon hearing footsteps in the supposedly empty building. The aftermath was a mix of relief and lingering dread, as they realized how easily a simple robbery could lead the police to their hidden door. They laughed about it later with their protectors, but the laughter was thin, a mask for the realization that their lives hung by the narrowest of threads. Spring brought no relief from the harsh realities of the occupation, as new decrees ordered the systematic removal of the remaining Jewish population. The girl watched from her hidden window as people were herded like cattle towards a grim fate, a sight that filled her dreams with nightmares. Yet even amidst this horror, there were small victories of resistance, the burning of administrative offices and the sabotage of documents that could send young men to labor camps. The residents of the annex celebrated these acts of defiance, finding hope in the courage of the students who refused to sign oaths of loyalty and the parachutists who dropped from burning planes, showing a calm self-possession that seemed almost superhuman to those watching from the safety of the shadows. Within the walls of the secret rooms, the passage of time was marked by the slow decay of their belongings and the sharpening of their internal conflicts. Clothes became threadbare, shoes grew too tight for growing feet, and the constant friction of shared confinement led to outbursts of temper and cold silences. A painful rift opened between the girl and her mother when a simple offer of a bedtime prayer was rebuffed, leaving the mother in tears and the girl hardened by a sense of emotional honesty that felt more like a burden than a virtue. She chose to remain cold, believing that the truth of their estrangement was better than a hollow performance of affection. Yet, on a day meant for celebration, the clouds parted briefly. For her birthday, the girl was showered with tokens of love, a book on the ancient myths she so adored, precious sweets saved from dwindling rations, and a heartfelt poem written by her father. The verses poked gentle fun at her growing pains and the absurdity of their situation, acknowledging the difficulty of being a parent and a child in a world turned upside down. As the youngest in this makeshift family, she felt a profound sense of being honored, a reminder that even in the heart of a storm, the bonds of family and the light of a birthday candle could provide a sanctuary of their own. The summer air within the secret rooms has grown thick with a mixture of mourning and a desperate, clinging hope. News arrived of the good man who worked in the warehouse below, a vital link to the outside world and a steady hand of guidance for the residents. When the doctors finally looked within him, they found a sickness so advanced that they could only sew him back up and send him home to spend his remaining days in comfort. The young girl feels a sharp pang of grief, wishing she could walk through the front door to sit by his side and offer the kind of distraction he once provided for them. His absence leaves a void in their security, a reminder that the pillars holding up their hidden life are fragile and few. As the authorities tighten their grip, the residents are forced to surrender their fine radio, replacing it with a smaller, illicit device hidden in the rafters. In a world where every transaction is a gamble and every possession a potential crime, this small box becomes their source of courage. Its miraculous voice whispers through the static, telling them to keep their spirits high and promising that better times are coming. Without the books provided by their devoted protectors and the steady hum of the radio, the walls of the annex would surely close in on them. The girl finds herself becoming more night-sighted, her world literally shrinking as she stares at pages for hours. Yet the risk of visiting a doctor on the street is a terrifying bridge that the family is not yet ready to cross. Daily life remains a delicate dance of forced politeness and suppressed rage. The girl struggles to maintain a mask of kindness, trying to treat the constant rain of criticism as a mere drizzle rather than a torrential downpour. Friction ignites over the smallest of territories, such as the single table in the bedroom.
When she politely requested a few hours a week to use it for her serious studies, the elderly dentist responded with a flat refusal, dismissing her interest in mythology and knitting as trivial compared to his own mysterious scientific work. The resulting argument required the father's quiet intervention, leading to a begrudging compromise that left the dentist in a 2-day sulk. To the girl, it is a lesson in the pettiness of age, that a man of over 50 years can be as small-minded and obstinate as a spoiled child. Danger remains an ever-present neighbor. Real thieves broke into the warehouse under the cover of night, making off with cash and, most devastatingly, a large supply of sugar coupons. The residents slept through the intrusion, only to wake to a command of absolute silence. No running water, no movement, no sound, until the extent of the break-in could be understood. This external threat was soon followed by the terrifying roar of a heavy bombardment on the northern parts of the city. As streets turned to ruins and hospitals overflowed with the wounded, the girl sat clutching her escape bag, knowing all the while that the street was as much a death trap as the building itself. Amidst this chaos, a sudden burst of joy arrived with the news that a great dictator had fallen in the South. The house erupted in a rare moment of triumph, a flicker of hope that the end of the war might finally be within reach, perhaps even before the year is out. The rhythm of their existence is dictated by the clock, a mechanical cycle of tension and brief respite. As night falls, the quiet of the annex is replaced by the frantic business of preparing for sleep. Chairs are moved to extend short sofas, beds are unfolded with a chorus of groans and creaks, and the residents take turns in the small washroom. The dentist's nocturnal habits, from his smacking of lips to the rustle of hidden food, provide the soundtrack to her wakeful hours, until the early morning sirens or the distant thud of bombs send her scurrying to the safety of her father's room. By noon, the warehouse below empties, and a different kind of quiet settles over the house. This is the time for Radio London, when everyone huddles around the small set in a rare moment of shared silence, listening to the one voice that none of them dare to contradict. Their protectors arrive like messengers from another realm, bringing soup, news of the city, and the occasional luxury of fresh fruit. As the afternoon wanes, the residents retreat into their own worlds, the father into his books, the mother and sister into the chores of the kitchen, and the girl into her studies. It is a life of waiting, waiting for the clock to strike 4, waiting for the sirens to cease, and waiting for the day they can once again walk freely into the sun.
The autumn of 1943 brings a deepening of the psychological shadows within the Secret Annex. While the world outside is shaken by the historic surrender of Italy, the world inside remains a claustrophobic stage where the same 8 characters perform their daily rituals of survival and irritation. The young girl has begun a new experiment in silence, choosing to hold her thoughts within herself to avoid the inevitable barbs and judgments of her companions. She finds solace in the rhythm of the mundane, the precise, potato-faced focus of her father during the daily peeling chores, or the small thrill of walking on high-heeled, wine-red suede shoes that make her feel taller than her reality. The dinner table has become a map of human frailty. There is the self-important patriarch of the upstairs family, whose opinion is law and whose ego is unshakable. Beside him, his wife, the instigator, flutters between coquettish charm and sharp-tongued provocation, always ensuring she secures the choicest morsel of food before it reaches anyone else. Their son remains a silent, hungry shadow, while the girl's own family maintains a quieter dignity. The dentist, however, is a clockwork nuisance. His life is governed by a rigorous schedule of sessions in the washroom, a territory he defends with a pedantic disregard for the frantic pacing figures waiting outside the door. These petty frictions are the true friction of their lives, wearing down their spirits as much as the threat of discovery. The constant tension has begun to take a physical toll. The girl now relies on valerian drops to combat the creeping fog of depression and fear, yet she finds that a heavy heart cannot be so easily lightened. The fear is not unfounded. The warehouse worker below has begun to cast suspicious eyes toward the hidden rooms. A moment of near calamity occurred when their protector, trying to be overly cautious, was forced to tiptoe through the building in his socks for nearly half an hour to avoid being seen, eventually emerging onto the street to put his shoes back on, like a common thief. Even their helpers are fraying. The young office girl, burdened by the secret and her own personal heartaches, stands on the verge of a nervous collapse. Hope arrives in bursts from the radio. The unconditional capitulation of Italy brings a rare moment of jubilation, with the forbidden anthems of the Allies echoing softly through the rooms. Yet this joy is tempered by the news that their beloved son, the helper who always brought light into the annex, must undergo a dangerous operation. As winter approaches, a season they all view as a great boulder blocking their path, the atmosphere in the annex grows colder and more fragile. The girl looks at the faces around her and sees the smiles fading, the mouths drooping, and the laughter becoming a forgotten language.
The winter of 1943 has settled over the secret annex like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The atmosphere is no longer merely tense, it has become leaden, a physical weight that turns every Sunday into a day of gray, airless despair. To Anne, the silence of the building feels like a predatory force that threatens to pull her down into an underground world. She describes herself as a songbird whose wings have been brutally clipped, beating her breast against the bars of a dark, narrow cage. While her parents and Margot try to maintain a stoic calm, Anne finds herself retreating into sleep just to kill the time and escape the creeping terror that the world outside will never again be ordinary. The financial foundations of their hidden life are crumbling. The Van Daan family has reached the end of their resources, leading to a spectacle of moral and emotional decay. A noble house that once held its head high is now filled with the echoes of shouting matches over a 17-year-old rabbit skin coat. Mr. Van Daan eventually forced his wife to sell the garment to pay for their shared expenses, resulting in a display of screaming and foot-stomping so violent that the Frank family stood trembling at the foot of the stairs, ready to intervene in a physical brawl. This desperation has turned every resident into a raw nerve. The mother's cheeks are perpetually flushed with stress. Margot suffers from blinding headaches, and the dentist, Mr. Dussel, has retreated into a petulant, silent standoff with his hosts. In the midst of this domestic warfare, Anne seeks refuge in the intellectual and the spiritual. Her father, ever the anchor of the group, orders a correspondence course in Latin for Margot, who throws herself into the difficult grammar as a form of escape. Anne, curious about the roots of the world that has rejected her, begins to study the New Testament through a children's Bible. This leads to a quiet, almost surreal conversation about the logistics of faith, whether Jesus is an appropriate topic for a Hanukkah gift or if it is better to wait for the arrival of St. Nicholas. Even her writing, her one true lifeline, suffers a blow when her beloved fountain pen, a gift from her grandmother that had survived since she was 9, is accidentally swept into the fireplace along with a pile of bean husks. Anne watches the celluloid flare up and settle into ash, finding a dark, poetic comfort in the thought that her pen was cremated, just as she wishes for herself when her time eventually comes. The psychological walls are thinning, and the outside world is bleeding into Anne's consciousness through vivid, terrifying visions. She is haunted by the image of her childhood friend, Lise, appearing before her in rags, with hollowed eyes. Lise looks at Anne with a gaze that asks, "Why have you abandoned me? Save me from this hell." This encounter triggers a profound crisis of survivor's guilt in Anne. She questions the cosmic lottery that allowed her to be chosen to live in the relative safety of the annex, while her friend, who was just as good and deserving, is being consumed by the darkness. This black, thundering cloud of the war is drawing a smaller and smaller circle around them, and the residents find themselves bumping into one another in the dark, desperately seeking an exit that does not exist. As the holidays approach, a wave of illness strikes the annex. The helpers are incapacitated, one by surgery, another by a contagious infection, leaving the residents more isolated and vulnerable than ever. Anne herself falls victim to a grueling flu, forced to endure the medical attentions of the dentist, whose outdated knowledge and deafness make his bedside manner an exercise in embarrassment and irritation. Yet even in this state of physical and emotional depletion, the human spirit flickers. For St. Nicholas Day, Anne and her father organize a surprise, a laundry basket filled with everyone's shoes, each containing a tiny hand-wrapped gift and a poem. This brief moment of shared laughter, along with Christmas brooches fashioned from polished coins, provides a momentary shield against the military lull and the gloomy mood of a winter that seems like it might never end.
The turn of the year 1944 marks a profound internal metamorphosis for Anne, as the claustrophobic walls of the secret annex become the backdrop for a deep psychological awakening. She finds herself suspended between two worlds, the heaven-high gratitude for her safety and a deathly sorrow for her stolen youth. This duality is captured in her use of Goethe's famous phrase, Himmel hoch jauchzend, zum Tode betrübt. While the world outside celebrates the holidays, the 8 residents sit like lepers, cut off from the vibrant life of theaters and hockey clubs that Anne so desperately craves. She yearns to laugh until her stomach hurts, to ride a bicycle, and to feel the wind on her face. Yet she's forced to wear a mask of strength, pouring her tears into the patient paper of her diary. This period is also one of intense self-reflection. Reviewing her earlier entries, Anne is shocked by the hate she once expressed toward her mother. She begins to view her younger self with a more objective eye, realizing that her past outbursts were a necessary safety valve for her stifled emotions. Despite this newfound maturity, a fundamental rift remains. Anne longs for a mummy who offers deep understanding and maternal respect, rather than a mother who treats her daughters as mere friends or laughs at her tears. She carries the sting of past rejections, like being excluded from a trip to the shops because she had her bicycle, and resolves to become the ideal mother for her own future children, one who takes a child's inner world seriously. Amidst this emotional turmoil, Anne is struck by the miracle of her own maturing body. She views the changes of puberty and the arrival of her menstrual cycle with a sense of sweet secrecy, finding beauty and wonder even in the physical discomfort. This blossoming womanhood brings a newfound awareness of herself as an independent individual, a person with her own distinct ideas and habits. She describes a physical longing for connection, sometimes placing her hand over her heart to feel its steady beat, or feeling overwhelmed to the point of tears by the sheer beauty of the human form. This deep loneliness drives her to seek out a confidant, and her eyes turn towards the only other young person in the annex, Peter. The figure of Peter has become a composite of memories and present longings. A vivid, visceral dream of her childhood crush, Peter Schiff, Wessel, leaves Anne reeling. In the dream, she feels his cool cheek against hers and sees his velvety brown eyes reading the very depths of her soul. Upon waking, she realizes that her childhood love has grown up alongside her, and she's consumed by a desperate need for that same affection in her waking life. This projection naturally falls upon Peter Van Daan. She begins to seek him out, finding excuses to visit his small room under the pretense of solving crossword puzzles,
all while searching his deep blue eyes for a sign of the maturity and understanding she so craves. The holidays offer a brief, surreal respite from this internal intensity. The protectors, Meep, Bep, and the others, deliver surprises that seem like relics from a forgotten world. A cake with Peace 1944 written in icing, real butter cookies, and even bottles of beer for the adults. These gestures of kindness are set against the persistent shadows of the past. Anne remains haunted by the memory of her grandmother, who bore her own internal illnesses with silent grace, and the vision of Hannelie, Lise, who represents the suffering of all Jews. Anne struggles with a crushing sense of survivor's guilt, wondering why she was chosen to live, while her friend endures hell. She finds herself praying for a miracle, even as she navigates the sweet secret of her own heart and the sudden, overwhelming realization that she is no longer a child.
The midwinter of 1944 marks a period of strange aesthetic defiance and a profound shift in Anne's moral compass. Despite the military lull and the gray confinement of the Annex, Anne finds a desperate outlet for her youth through dance. Using a light blue lace petticoat of her mother's, she sews herself a super modern ballet dress, attempting to transform her ordinary rubber sneakers into ballet slippers. She spends her evenings practicing steps, pushing her body to regain its former flexibility, finding a momentary escape in movement, even as she is forced to cushion the floor to protect herself from the hard boards. This physical transformation mirrors a deeper psychological one. She has begun to view her life as if through the eyes of a stranger, calmly flipping through the book of her own existence as if reading about someone else. The atmosphere in the house remains one of friction and petty division. The two families have begun to partition their lives even more strictly, dividing butter, meat, and fat, and frying their potatoes separately to avoid accusations of greed. Hunger has become a constant companion. The residents now eat extra rye bread just to quiet their rumbling stomachs until the evening meal. As her mother's birthday approaches, the familiar cycles of envy and spite reappear, sparked by a gift of sugar from Mr. Kleiman, a gesture the Van Daans view with bitter resentment. Anne's mother expresses a single, impossible wish for her birthday, to spend 2 weeks without seeing the Van Daans at all. Anne, witnessing this, begins to wonder if this selfishness is a universal human trait or merely the result of their specific bad luck. However, a remarkable change has occurred in Anne's heart. Since the night of her vivid dream about Peter, she feels she has matured into an independent personality. She has begun to question the rigid, judgmental stance her own parents take toward the Van Daans. With a newfound sense of empathy, she realizes that while Mrs. Van Daan is far from refined, much of the domestic warfare could be avoided if her own mother were less stubborn and more open to friendly discussion. She decides that from this day forward, gossip belongs to the past. She resolves to judge the Van Daans for herself, seeking out opportunities to speak openly with Mrs. Van Daan and using her own neutral opinion to bridge the gap, even at the risk of being called a know-it-all. This internal shift toward tolerance is anchored by her growing obsession with Peter. She finds strength in the secret she carries, touching her locket and feeling that as long as Peter is hers, the surrounding mess of arguments cannot touch her. She looks at the adults around her and wonders why people are so cowardly in hiding their inner worlds and why they trust each other so little. Anne is no longer the child who simply reacts to the barbs of those above her. She is a young woman trying to apply a little more understanding to a world that seems to have forgotten the meaning of the word. She prays that she won't turn into a dried-up bean pod before she has the chance to live as a real girl. But for now, her secret love and her evolving conscience are the only fresh air she can find.
In the final week of 1944, a profound shift occurs in the way Anne views the boundaries between childhood and maturity. Her curiosity, once suppressed by the mystery and disgust with which the adults in her life treated the topic of sex, finds an unexpected and natural outlet through Peter. This development begins with a simple, almost comical debate over the warehouse cat, Mushi. Peter, asserting his knowledge, offers to prove the cat is male, leading Anne to follow him into the quiet, freezing warehouse. In the solitude of the storehouse, away from the prying eyes of their parents, Peter demonstrates the cat's anatomy with a directness that shocks and then liberates Anne. He speaks about male sex organs with such lack of embarrassment or stupid double meanings that Anne finds herself responding with a normalcy she never thought possible. This exchange shatters the warnings her mother once gave her, never to speak of such things with boys, and leaves Anne reflecting on the rare quality of a young man who can discuss delicate matters without mockery. She is struck by the realization that everything changes, and she finds herself wondering if Peter's naturalness comes from the open relationship he claims to have with his father. While her internal world expands, Anne's daily life remains a meticulous balance of academic rigor and specialized hobbies. She has become the Annex's resident expert on film stars and royal genealogies. To the annoyance of the older residents, who view it as a waste of money, Mr. Kleiman brings her cinema and theater magazine every Monday. Anne's memory for cinema has become so sharp that she can recite the reviews and cast lists of films she has never seen, leading her mother to joke that Anne will have no need to visit a theater after the war. However, Anne's attempts to bring this stardom into her reality through elaborate new hairstyles are often crushed by the harsh criticism of the group, forcing her to flee to the bathroom and return to her ordinary garden-variety appearance. The psychological toll of their confinement is most evident during mealtime conversations. Anne describes the residents as a herd of cows chewing the same old news over and over. Every story told by the adults, from Mr. Dussel's tales of his wife's wardrobe to the Van Daans' endless anecdotes about their former grocers, is so familiar that the listeners can finish the sentences before the speaker. To avoid screaming or correcting the exaggerated lies, Anne finds herself literally pinching her arm under the table. Yet, amidst this stifling repetition is a deep, reverent appreciation for their helpers. Anne reflects on the quiet heroism of Miep, Henk, and the others, who risk their lives daily to navigate the dangerous world of the underground. She learns of the bold tricks being played across Holland, football matches played by people in hiding against border police, and separate windows at government offices where illegals can collect their ration cards at designated hours. These stories of resistance provide a stark contrast to their own stagnant life. Anne realizes that while the world witnesses heroism on the battlefield, the Annex is sustained by a different kind of bravery, the daily love and encouraging support of friends who treat the burden of 8 hidden people as if it were no burden at all. In the shivering transition from winter to spring 1944, the Secret Annex is gripped by a feverish duality: the cold, calculated fear of a city under siege, and the sudden blooming warmth of Anne's first real romance. The atmosphere is thick with the anticipation of a second front. Newspapers are filled with maps of shaded flood zones, leading to surreal, macabre debates at the dinner table. The residents wonder how they will survive if the Germans flood Amsterdam. Ideas range from the absurd, swimming underwater with bathing caps so no one can see we are Jews, to the practical, such as rowing through the streets in sugar crates or walking on stilts. Beneath the laughter, however, is a grim reality.
They begin sewing secret pockets for their money and obsessively counting their 30 kilograms of beans and jars of preserved strawberries, preparing for a day when the gas and electricity will vanish and they will be left to cook over a fireplace. Amidst this talk of flooding and deathly sorrow, Anne finds herself surrendering to a different kind of flood, the awakening of her own heart. She observes with a jolt of joy that Peter is looking at her differently, and she begins to seek him out in the attic, finding in him a mirrored soul. The confidant in the attic. Their bond is forged in the quiet of the warehouse and the attic, away from the prying eyes and sharp tongues of the adults. Following a heated confrontation over the radio with Mr. Dussel, Peter opens up to Anne about his own deep-seated frustrations. He confesses his inferiority complex, admitting that he often feels stupid and struggles to express himself with words, preferring to use his fists in the past. Anne, sitting on a cushion on the floor with her arms around her knees, listens with a focused intensity. She realizes that they share the same internal rages and the same desperate need for a soul who truly understands. This connection is forged by a warm and tender gaze from Peter that leaves Anne feeling a physical warmth she has never known. A fragile intimacy. Their relationship develops through small, stolen moments of vulnerability. Peter admits to Anne that he finds comfort in the cat, Mushi, and that the film star posters on his wall have become his friends in the absence of real ones. He even touches on the dishonesty of their situation, confessing that he sometimes wishes he had been born a Christian or could pass as one after the war to avoid the burden of being Jewish, a sentiment that stings Anne's heart. Yet, despite his flaws, she finds herself drawn to his gentleness. When he catches her by the arm to stop her from doing a chore, she feels a spark of connection that makes the military lull of the outside world feel irrelevant. The agony of the spring. Despite this new hope, Anne remains a prisoner of her own teenage intensity. She describes the arrival of spring as a physical ache, a longing that makes her feel as if she might burst. She fluctuates between the high of a shared glance and the crushing depths of loneliness. On one particularly dark Saturday, she retreats to the bathroom with a pocket mirror, weeping until her red apron is stained with tears, terrified that she is merely imagining Peter's affection and that he might not need a friend as much as she does. Her mother's disapproval and suspicious looks only heighten her sense of isolation. Anne is no longer the child who simply records the quarrels of the annex. She is a young woman who has turned her gaze inward, finding strength in a sweet secret. She resolves to leave her fate to God and the Allies, focusing instead on the miracle of her own maturing spirit and the quiet, blue-eyed boy waiting for her at the top of the stairs. The blossoming of spring 1944 brings a radical shift in Anne's world. While the physical walls of the secret annex remain as tight as ever, her internal horizon has expanded toward the blue sky, the budding chestnut tree, and the quiet, blue-eyed boy in the attic. This period is defined by a newfound spiritual resilience and the agonizing, beautiful tension of a first love. The Cathedral of the Attic. Anne has discovered that the cure for her deathly sorrow is nature. From the dust of the attic, she gazes at the bare chestnut tree, dripping with silver raindrops, and the seagulls gliding like metal through the air. In these moments, she reaches a profound realization. As long as the sun shines and the sky remains clear, she can never truly be unhappy. She develops a philosophy of joy that contrasts sharply with her mother's. While her mother advises her to think of all the misery in the world and be grateful, Anne believes the opposite. Go outside, to the fields, the nature, and the sun. Think of all the beauty that still remains in and around you and be happy. The two Peters. Anne's emotional life becomes a swirling fusion of the past and present. Her childhood crush, Peter Schiff, and her current companion, Peter Van Daan, have merged in her mind into one Peter, who represents all her longings for tenderness.
She finds herself in a state of constant anticipation, living from one encounter to the next. The shared silence. In the attic, Anne and Peter spend long stretches in a breathless silence, watching the Amsterdam skyline. She realizes that their souls are more alike than she once thought. Both feel motherless in a spiritual sense, and both have built protective shells. Anne through her loud, brash talk, and Peter through his stony indifference. Breaking the armor. Their conversations grow deeper. Peter confesses his parents' constant quarrels and his own fear of being stupid. Anne, in turn, offers him the big, devoted love she feels they both lack. When he asks her if she is in love because her face is flushed, she answers with a naive, "Why?" Yet her heart is pounding. She begins to see him as a man of character, much like her father. The mirror of the past. On March 7th, Anne takes a long, analytical look at her former self through a magnifying glass. She sees the 1942 version of Anne as a pleasant but superficial girl, a flirt who lived for the applause of teachers and a circle of 20 friends. She realizes that she used her jokes as a mask to hide an inner void. The transformation. Since entering hiding, she has moved through phases: the initial shock and cheekiness of 1942, the tears and self-reproach of 1943, and finally the independent, thinking woman of 1944. She no longer wants admirers, she wants friends who admire her character, not her jokes. She has learned that she can no longer trust even Pim, her father, with everything. She must be her own person. Shadows in the office. The fragile peace of their emotional world is shattered by a new robbery at the office. This time, it is more complicated than before. A thief with a duplicate key seems to have entered the building while the residents were still active upstairs, stealing a projector and a briefcase. The fear that the thief might be a warehouse worker who heard Mr. Van Daan moving about casts a pall over the annex. Yet, even as the threat of discovery looms, Anne's thoughts quickly drift back to Peter. She finds that her soul ache is more persistent than the fear of the police. The agony of the unsaid. Anne is currently caught in a chaos of thoughts. She feels she's playing a comedy for her family, being brash and samovarana, self-confident, to hide the fact that she is desperate inside. She watches Peter's every move, wondering if he's as impatient for their meetings as she is. She finds herself grateful for the good, their safety, the beautiful, the sky, and the dear, the growing, fragile love for Peter.
The transition from late winter to early spring brings a profound shift in the atmosphere of the Hidden Annex, as the stifling air of confinement is momentarily cleared by the promise of nature and the blossoming of a deep, complicated bond. Anne finds herself drawn repeatedly to the attic, seeking the fresh air that her small room denies her. From a favorite spot on the floor, she gazes at the blue sky and the bare chestnut tree, its branches glistening with raindrops. In the presence of birds gliding like silver through the air, she experiences a quiet, shared understanding with Peter that transcends the need for words. She discovers that the ultimate remedy for fear or loneliness is to be alone with nature, believing that as long as the sun shines and the sky remains clear, a fundamental happiness can endure within the heart, regardless of external hardship. This internal joy, however, is frequently tested by the turbulent emotions of adolescence and the constant friction of life in hiding. Anne finds herself increasingly preoccupied with Peter, dreaming of him and seeking his gaze. She recognizes a profound similarity between them, noting that both feel a lack of true maternal understanding. While Anne reacts to the harshness of their environment by becoming loud and boisterous, clattering pots and making noise to mask her vulnerability, Peter retreats into silence and dreams. She struggles to balance her intense longing for him with the need to remain cheerful for the rest of the household, even when she feels inwardly desperate. This emotional weight is compounded by the news of a sophisticated burglary at the office below, where a thief used a duplicate key to steal a projector and a briefcase, leaving the families in a state of heightened anxiety about their safety. Despite the external threats and the criticisms of the adults, who often dismiss the opinions and feelings of the younger residents, Anne continues to seek out Peter's company. They share long conversations about their families and their pasts, finding a rare sense of trust in one another. Anne even encourages Peter to confide in her father, whom they both admire as a man of character. She notices the warmth in Peter's eyes and finds herself on the verge of falling in love, relishing every stolen moment they spend together studying French or English. This connection becomes the center of her existence, providing a sense of purpose that makes the dreary Saturdays of confinement finally bearable. Reflecting on her life before they went into hiding, Anne sees a girl she hardly recognizes, a popular, flirtatious student surrounded by admirers and friends. She views that former self through a magnifying glass, seeing a superficial child who used jokes and charm to fill an inner void. The transition from that carefree life to the current reality of accusations and tears has been difficult, yet it has led her to a deeper self-awareness. She has moved through phases of loneliness and self-reproach to a point where she now wishes to form her own character and trust in her own judgment. She rejects her mother's advice to find comfort in the misery of others, choosing instead to look outward at the beauty of the world and inward at the goodness within herself. Though she still faces moments of overwhelming soul ache and must hide her true feelings behind a mask of confidence, she remains hopeful that the fragile bond she shares with Peter will eventually grow into the future and happiness they both seek.
The creeping onset of spring has brought little relief to the Secret Annex. Instead, the physical reality of the fourth year of the war has become a test of endurance and sensory tolerance. The small community is currently facing a dire food crisis after the arrest of their bean suppliers, leaving them with coupon books but no actual provisions. The atmosphere is thick with the putrid stench of year-old pickled cabbage, a smell so offensive, resembling a mixture of rotten plums, harsh preservatives, and spoiled eggs, that Anne must sit at the table with a perfume-soaked handkerchief pressed to her nose just to breathe. Even the staple potatoes have succumbed to decay, with half of every batch lost to various diseases that the residents have jokingly categorized as smallpox or cancer. With their primary helpers sidelined by illness, gripped by everything from severe influenza to a sudden stomach hemorrhage, the residents find themselves in an increasingly desperate and isolated position. The monotony of their diet, now consisting largely of watery porridge and foul-smelling cabbage, has sharpened the tempers of the 5 adults, revealing the distinct ways each copes with the mounting pressure. One resident clings to the kitchen as her only domain, grumbling that her efforts are met with nothing but ingratitude, while she predicts a dark end to the conflict. Her husband remains obsessed with his tobacco, believing that as long as he has a cigarette, the world remains tolerable, though his lack of supplies often leads to explosive arguments. Anne's mother longs for the simple luxury of a slice of rye bread and struggles to keep her nerves from fraying, while her father maintains a steadfast, almost defiant optimism, insisting that time is on their side and offering his own meager rations to their helpers. Meanwhile, the dentist remains fixated on his daily schedule, repeating a personal mantra of I, as a shield against the encroaching chaos. The situation outside the annex is equally grim, as the residents learn through news brought by their few healthy contacts. They listen with rapt attention, like children gathered around a storyteller, to reports of a world where medical care has been reduced to brief, impersonal telephonic consultations. In a city overwhelmed with sickness and a shortage of physicians, a doctor might simply ask a patient to stick out their tongue at the telephone receiver before barking out a prescription and ending the call. While Anne finds humor in the absurdity of these telephonic examinations, the underlying reality is sobering. The helpers are exhausted, the office staff is being summoned for forced labor, and the families are frequently forced to remain as silent as mice for entire days to avoid detection by neighbors. Yet, despite the stench of rotting food and the what-if anxieties that haunt their conversations, Anne continues to record these details with a sharp eye, capturing the slow, grinding erosion of their daily lives.
The promise of spring remains an indescribable beauty, drawing the young residents toward the attic, where the air feels lighter and the world seems briefly vast. In this high sanctuary, a quiet transformation is taking place. Anne has begun to realize that the restlessness she feels is born from a lack of privacy. Unlike her companion, who has a small room of his own to dream and reflect, she is constantly pushed from corner to corner. To survive this, she has built a wall of silence around her heart, becoming colder toward her mother and withdrawing from her sister. She maintains an outward mask of confidence, hiding the fierce struggle between her logical mind and her deepest longings. She wonders if the quiet, reserved boy she admires can see through her iron armor, and if he is perhaps the only one who truly understands the sensitivity hidden behind her constant chatter. The atmosphere within the household has settled into a temporary calm, as the immediate threat of forced labor for their helpers has passed. However, a different kind of tension persists between the generations. Both Anne and her sister feel the weight of parental supervision, which treats them like children despite their inner maturity. They are weary of the constant questions about their health, the need for approval on every book they read, and the forced affectionate gestures that feel increasingly hollow. At 14, Anne feels she has outgrown the need for such guidance. She views herself as an independent individual with firm principles and a sharp sense of justice. She finds herself admiring the boy in the attic more each day, seeing in him a quiet intelligence that matches her own evolving spirit. A significant turning point occurred on a recent evening when Anne finally summoned the courage to ask for a private conversation. Under the cover of twilight at an open window, they spoke for a long time about the things that truly mattered. They discussed the distance growing between them and their parents, and the different ways they cope with their shared isolation. While she cries in her bed at night, he retreats to the attic to release his frustrations. Their exchange revealed a touching vulnerability. He confessed that he had almost never known the simple affection of a goodnight kiss, a sharp contrast to the rituals of her family. They laughed about their initial dislike for one another 2 years ago, when she seemed too talkative and he too dull, only to realize that they have both changed beyond recognition. The evening ended with a revelation that filled Anne with a profound sense of happiness. When she offered to help him navigate his loneliness, he admitted that her cheerful presence had already been a source of support for him. This small admission, the idea that her spirit could light up his world, felt like a shared secret between them. Now every glance and every smile exchanged in the crowded rooms of the annex feels like a hidden language. She is no longer just a girl recording the quarrels of adults. She is a young woman who has found a mirror in another's soul. Though she struggles to find the right words to describe her joy, she feels a newfound peace, hopeful that many more hours of shared understanding await them in the quiet corners of their hiding place. The blossoming connection between Anne and Peter has reached a gentle invitation, as he has begun to ask why she does not visit him more often. He assures her that where there is room for one, there is surely room for two, and they have even made a pact to watch the moon together from the lower windows when the sky is full. However, this newfound happiness is tinged with a delicate sadness for Anne's sister.
Anne has long suspected that her sister also harbors feelings for Peter, and she worries that every trip to the attic inflicts a silent, unbearable pain upon her sibling. This concern reveals a deepening maturity in Anne, as she wrestles with the guilt of her own joy while navigating a growing emotional distance from her parents, who treat her with a coldness she finds difficult to bridge. A remarkable exchange of letters has passed between the two sisters, providing a window into their distinct inner worlds in the profound bond they share. The older sister, displaying a selfless and quiet dignity, reached out to reassure Anne that she does not feel envy toward their budding friendship. She explains that while she longs for a confidant of her own, someone with whom she could share her deepest thoughts, she does not believe Peter is the intellectual match she requires for such an intimate bond. She views him more as a younger brother and encourages Anne to embrace the comfort they find in each other, insisting that there is no need for guilt. Anne, moved by this display of character, responds with admiration, admitting that the half-light of an open window allows for a vulnerability that the bright sun does not, and she promises to advocate for her sister's friendship should the opportunity arise. Within the cramped confines of the annex, the possibility of a great and true love has become a source of light. Anne no longer views herself as the superficial girl the others see. She is a dreamer who has found a mirror in a boy who struggles with the same internal hardships. Peter has confessed to Anne that her cheerful spirit helps him endure the constant arguments between his parents. And when she playfully asked how he would handle a dozen girls like her, he replied that it wouldn't be bad at all if they were exactly like her. He has even begun to apply himself more seriously to his studies, working on his French late into the night. Anne finds beauty in every facet of his personality, from his laughter to his quiet, contemplative gazes, and she feels a rare sense of satisfaction in knowing that they have begun to truly see one another. As they navigate this uncertain path, Anne remains grounded in the reality of their situation, uncertain where this affection will lead or whether it will one day result in something as permanent as marriage. For now, she is content to live in the mystery of his feelings, unsure if he sees her as a friend, a sister, or something more. The sisters have agreed to let time decide the future of these relationships, maintaining a steady hope that better days are approaching. Anne encourages her sister to not lose heart, believing that everyone's time for happiness will come, perhaps even sooner than they dared to imagine. Amidst the darkness of the war and the narrow walls of their world, these small, whispered confidences in the dark have become the most vital part of their existence.
The rhythmic grind of the Secret Annex has returned to a fragile state of normalcy, much to the relief of its inhabitants. Those who provide the vital lifeblood of the household, the suppliers of ration coupons, have finally been released from their imprisonment, easing the immediate threat of starvation. While some of the helpers remain housebound with lingering illnesses, the presence of others brings a renewed sense of security. Yet the world outside remains a theater of violence and cruelty. Recently, a plane fell from the sky, its crew drifting downward on white parachutes. The aircraft crashed into a nearby school, fortunately empty of children at the time, but the scene was marred by the cowardice of those on the ground who turned their weapons toward the defenseless men suspended in the air. This display of malice left the city in a state of righteous anger, a sentiment deeply felt by the women in hiding, for whom the sound of gunfire remains an abhorrent reminder of their vulnerability. Seeking refuge from the heavy atmosphere below, the girl finds herself drawn more frequently to the attic sanctuary. In the quiet of the evening, she sits by the open window, breathing in the cool air and finding a rare comfort in the presence of her companion. Their growing closeness has not escaped the notice of the adults, who find a petty amusement in making sharp, foolish remarks. They mock the attic as her second home and question the propriety of a young lady visiting a gentleman in the dark. The boy, however, displays a surprising strength of spirit, shielding her from these barbs by reminding her that such bitterness is merely a symptom of the adult's envy toward their youth. Even her mother's prying curiosity is held at bay by a fear of a sharp rebuttal. While the boy often blushes and struggles to find his words when he comes to fetch her, the girl finds a quiet pride in her own composure, relishing the small, genuine compliments he offers. When he tells her that she is beautiful when she laughs, pointing out the dimples on her cheeks and chin, it feels like a rare moment of light in a world that so often misunderstands the seriousness of youth. Politics, a subject that often feels like a dry and distant burden, has become the primary fuel for the relentless friction between the adults. The girl observes that while history will record the movements of armies and the speeches of leaders, the reality of life in hiding is defined by the endless circular debates that follow every radio broadcast. The residents of the house are divided into camps of optimists, pessimists, and those who claim to be realists, each clinging to their own interpretation of the war's progress with tireless energy. A mention of the opening of a second front or a new air raid is enough to ignite a firestorm of arguments. The girl has even discovered that she can use politics as a tool. A single question or a stray observation is like the prick of a needle, causing the entire family to erupt into a heated dispute. The radio has become the central altar of their daily lives, humming with the voices of broadcasters from London or the Queen in exile. To the younger inhabitants, the constant repetition of news is a source of exhaustion, yet the adults possess an inexplicable patience for listening to the same reports hour after hour, from early morning until late into the night. They gather around the receiver, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the tension of waiting for a sign that their ordeal might end. In one particularly intimate moment, the group huddles together to hear a speech by a favored foreign leader. The scene appears peaceful on the surface, a cat dozing across the knees of two sisters, a father sipping tea, and a mother in a long dressing gown. But beneath this domestic veneer, the girl watches with a sense of dread, knowing that as soon as the voice on the radio ceases, the temporary peace will shatter, replaced once again by the sharp tongues and restless tempers of people who have forgotten how to be young.
The promise of spring in the Secret Annex is increasingly hindered by barriers erected by the adults, whose presence often feels heavier than the stone walls themselves. Anne finds herself at the center of a silent conflict. Her mother has restricted her visits to the attic, citing the jealousy of other residents as the primary reason. Yet beneath this superficial explanation, Anne senses deeper undercurrents, perhaps a lack of understanding, or even her mother's own form of resentment. While her father shows a greater tolerance for her growing bond with Peter, Anne feels increasingly estranged from her mother, convinced that a fundamental spiritual connection is missing between them. Simultaneously, her sister displays remarkable character by stepping aside, admitting that while she longs for a confidant, she does not believe Peter is the intellectual partner she requires. Anne remains captivated by the multifaceted nature of the boy in the attic. She sees the child in him when he plays with the cat, the strong provider when he hauls heavy provisions, and the brave protector when he checks for intruders in the dark. She yearns for a moment of true physical closeness, a touch or a word to confirm that their feelings are mutual, but for now she contents herself with their whispered confidences in the twilight of the attic. She has discovered a surprising pleasure in being the one who listens to his explanations rather than being the teacher, finding that she prefers him to excel. This internal drama unfolds against the backdrop of a world in ruin. One evening, a government minister announces over the radio the intention to collect diaries and letters after the war, prompting Anne to seriously consider the value of her writings as a historical testament. The reality outside has become brutal and desperate. Anne describes a nation gripped by a wave of crime, where even young children break into homes to steal whatever they can find, and street clocks and telephone wires vanish in a matter of hours. People walk in rags, wearing old shoes that no cobbler can repair in time, and food has become an obsession for all of Europe. In the Annex, they endure food periods, months on end where they eat nothing but a single specific vegetable, whether it be spinach or pickled cabbage. Currently, they subsist on a diet of beans and potatoes, which appear at every meal, even in the bread, while sticky dumplings made of flour and yeast sit in their stomachs like heavy stones. Despite the hunger and the lingering cold, as many have long since run out of coal, optimism is fueled by news from the front. The advance of the Russian armies toward Poland and Romania is followed with trembling hope, and the triumphant salvos from Moscow echo in the hearts of the hidden families. Anne admits that her life has become brighter because she is no longer alone in her dreams. Though she feels a painful impatience for a first true kiss and wonders if Peter is simply too shy to speak his heart, she gathers the strength to be patient. She believes that overcoming these small and great hardships will only make the eventual triumph and the return to freedom even more beautiful.
In the quiet solitude of the early spring, Anne has come to a profound realization about her own future and the power of her voice. For a long time, the end of the conflict felt like a ghost, too distant and unreal to grasp, leading her into a deep, wordless despair. Following a night of intense, solitary weeping on the bare floor, she emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. She has resolved that she must work and learn to avoid becoming like the women she sees around her, those whose lives are defined only by household chores and eventually forgotten. She dreams of becoming a journalist and a famous writer, expressing her thoughts, ideals, and fantasies through the written word. Writing has become her sanctuary. It is the process through which her sorrow vanishes and her courage is reborn. She finds herself to be her own strictest critic, yet she is fueled by the hope that her talent might one day allow her to be remembered long after she is gone. Beyond her primary passion for writing, Anne's world is filled with a vast array of intellectual pursuits. She spends her hours meticulously tracing the genealogical trees of European royal families, from the French and Austrians to the Russians and Dutch. Her hunger for knowledge extends into history and the mythologies of ancient Greece and Rome, subjects for which her father has provided several books. While she harbors a distinct dislike for mathematics and algebra, she is captivated by the history of art, particularly the lives of writers and painters. These hobbies provide a necessary escape from the suffocating air of the Annex, allowing her mind to wander through centuries of human achievement while her body remains confined. However, the fragile peace of their hidden world was recently shattered by a terrifying night that tested their collective courage. While Anne and Peter were enjoying a rare, intimate moment, listening to a Mozart concert on the radio and whispering among sofa cushions in the attic, the threat of the outside world suddenly intruded. A group of burglars attempted to break into the warehouse below, forcing the men of the house, Anne's father, Peter, and the others, to descend into the darkness to protect their sanctuary. The women remained upstairs in a state of paralyzing fear, their faces pale as they waited in the shadows, listening to every muffled noise from below. For long, agonizing minutes, the silence was broken only by the striking of the clock, leaving them to wonder if their protectors were safe or if the police had finally arrived. The confrontation in the warehouse was a scene of desperate bravado. When the men discovered the thieves trying to kick in a large wooden plank from the door, the older man shouted, "Police!" to frighten them away. The burglars fled, but the danger intensified when a man and a woman from the street shone a bright flashlight through the hole, illuminating the entire space. Realizing that their presence might be betrayed not just to criminals, but to the authorities, the four men retreated behind the secret bookcase. In a frantic attempt to make the premises look like a scene of a standard robbery rather than a hiding place, Peter knocked the telephone to the floor and left doors slightly ajar before they all scrambled into the safety of the annex, locking themselves away and waiting in the dark for what might come next.
The harrowing night of the break-in became a defining test of courage for the inhabitants of the annex. For hours they sat in absolute, suffocating darkness, listening to the rhythmic pounding of their own hearts. The terror reached a pitch when heavy footsteps ascended the stairs and hands rattled the secret bookcase. Twice. In that moment, Anne was certain the end had come, imagining the Gestapo dragging them away. One of the most painful moments for her was hearing a suggestion to burn her diary to destroy evidence. She felt a fierce, desperate resolve that her diary must survive, even if she did not. When the footsteps finally receded, the residents were left in a state of physical and emotional collapse, forced to use shared buckets for relief in the dark and sleeping on the hard floor amidst the stench and the silence. By dawn, the annex looked like a battlefield of domestic chaos. Piles of clothes, half-eaten bread, and medical supplies scattered in a desperate, beautiful mixture. The arrival of their helpers, Hank and Meep, brought a flood of tears and relief. They learned that the police had indeed searched the building after a night watchman noticed the hole in the door, yet by some miracle, the officers had failed to discover the secret behind the moving cupboard. Even more touching was the revelation that their greengrocer had seen the burglars and intentionally stayed silent, suspecting the house held a secret he didn't want to betray. This brush with death forced a new, stricter set of rules upon the group. No more using the office bathrooms, silenced water pipes after dark, and reinforced security checks. In the aftermath, the mood shifted from raw fear to profound reflection. The helpers and Mr. Kraler reminded them sternly of their status. They were marked Jews, people without rights but with 1,000 obligations to stay hidden and strong. This prompted Anne to write one of her most powerful meditations on identity. She questioned why Jews had been singled out for such suffering throughout history, but concluded that their endurance would eventually turn them into an example for the world. She expressed a fierce pride in her heritage, while simultaneously declaring her dream to become a Dutch citizen after the war, driven by a love for the country and its language. She felt she had been ready to die like a soldier on the battlefield, but now that she was saved, her ambition was renewed. Anne's internal growth has accelerated through this crisis. She feels increasingly independent of her parents and confident in her own strength as a woman. She is no longer content to lead a quiet domestic life like her mother. She wants to work in the world and for mankind. Her bond with Peter has also deepened. After the danger passed, they stood together in the attic, arms entwined, finding a calm peace amidst the sounding sirens. She thanked him for being the bravest of them all, realizing that they shared a connection that transcended words. With a renewed sense of purpose, Anne has decided that no matter what happens, she will face the future with courage and joy, determined to be remembered for more than just her suffering. While the air in the secret annex remains thick with tension, sparked by the plumbing failures, the lack of tobacco for Mr. Van Daan, and the general irritability of the adults, Anne has found an emotional refuge that makes the dust and grime of their hiding place disappear. She acknowledges that everything is backward in the annex, with everyone sighing and complaining that they wish it were all over. Yet she realizes that one's environment is what they make of it. Armed with her work, her hope, and her newfound love, she feels supported by an inner strength, even as she self-deprecatingly wonders if anyone will ever care about the revelations of an ugly duckling once the war is over. April 15, 1944, however, marked a day she will never forget, the day of her first real kiss. Anne describes the moment with breathless detail, sitting on Peter's sofa, their hearts beating together as he pulled her close. The physical closeness provided a sense of security and pleasure so profound it left her speechless. After a long moment of leaning against one another, Peter kissed her through her hair, touching her cheek and ear. Anne's reaction was a mix of pure joy and a sudden impulse to flee. She ran downstairs without looking back, her heart full of the realization that she is no longer just a child, but a young woman experiencing the thrill of being wanted.
Yet she justifies her actions by the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. Shut away from the world in constant fear, she asks why they should be denied the comfort of love while they wait for an uncertain future. While she grapples with whether she should tell her father, she is determined to ensure that her relationship with Peter is built on more than just physical affection. She wants a bond of deep trust and shared thoughts. The arrival of spring has brought a bittersweet beauty to their confinement. The chestnut tree outside is turning green, showing the first candles of its blossoms, and Bep has brightened their rooms with bouquets of narcissa and a fragrant blue hyacinth. Peter and Anne have finally begun to have the deep, intimate conversations she craved, moving beyond simple embraces to discuss the complexities of growing up. As she sits by the open window, feeling the sun on her cheeks and Peter's arm around her, Anne finds a rare moment of absolute peace. In the silence between them, the world of the war and the cramped annex fades away, leaving only the song of the birds and the quiet certainty of their connection.
While the older residents of the annex succumbed to the weariness of confinement, with Mrs. Van Daan complaining about her cold and the delay of the second front, and Mr. Van Daan growing irritable without his cigarettes, Anne has thrown herself into an almost frantic intellectual discipline. Her days are a whirlwind of global exploration and historical research. She travels from the life of Charles V and the Great Northern War to the tobacco fields of Brazil and the mysteries of the Amazon. Between calculating the number of toes on a hippopotamus and tracing royal family trees back to the 1940s, she finds that her mind is a vast, uncontainable territory. Despite a lingering cold that has swept through the family, her spirits remain high, buoyed by Peter's playful affection and his nickname for her, his Eldorado. However, beneath this scholarly exterior, a much deeper emotional transformation is taking place. Anne describes the emergence of a second Anne, a version of herself that is no longer the talkative, cheeky schoolgirl everyone knows, but a soul that is quiet, tender, and vulnerable. During an evening in the attic, the ordinary mask fell away, and she found herself weeping silently against Peter's shoulder, overwhelmed by a feeling of goodness and connection. This tenderness culminated in a moment of staggering intensity. As they moved to say goodbye at the window, their lips finally met in a real, breathless kiss. Anne felt dazed, as if they could never stop, realizing that for both of them, this is the first time they have truly opened their hearts and shared themselves with another person. This awakening has left Anne in a state of internal conflict, caught in a struggle between heart and reason. After the intoxicating intimacy of the attic, she finds the descent back into the brightly lit room of her parents, with their laughter and questions, to be a jarring shock. She questions whether she is giving in too quickly to her longings, and wonders if she is acting as a young girl should. She worries about the strength of Peter's character, seeing him as someone who seeks only peace and happiness, perhaps lacking the resilience she feels within herself. She asks herself if she is truly only 14, or if the extraordinary circumstances of her life have given her an experience far beyond her years. Despite these doubts, the longing for comfort in their shared isolation remains the most powerful force in her life. She recognizes that Peter is discovering, for the first time, that even the most annoying girl can have a rich inner world, and she too has found the confidence she has always lacked. Though she fears her own impulsiveness and wonders where this path will lead, she cannot ignore the way Peter has shaken her soul. For now, she continues to navigate the complex boundary between being a child and becoming a woman, clutching her Eldorado as a shield against the darkness of the war outside.
Trust between Anne and Peter has reached a new stage of maturity after the two made the decision to no longer hide their feelings from Anne's father. When she finally gathers the courage to speak with Pym, his initial reaction is calm, but his paternal concern soon takes over. In a serious conversation, he warns Anne that within the cramped confines of the secret annex, emotions can easily become dangerous. He advises her to be more restrained and not to encourage Peter toward feelings that, in isolation, are perceived much more intensely than in the normal world. Father emphasizes that although Peter is a good boy, he has a weak character and is easily influenced, which places a greater responsibility on Anne. This conversation, however, triggers a wave of inner defiance in the young girl. Although she respects her father, Anne feels torn between his sensible advice and her own need for support and tenderness. She shares her father's concerns with Peter, but at the same time, she declares her full and unreserved trust in him, a gesture that visibly moves and unsettles the boy. Peter, for his part, promises her father that he will exercise self-control, but for Anne, this promise is no reason to withdraw. She sees in him not just an infatuation, but a deep spiritual connection that gives her the strength to survive their harsh environment. In her diary, Anne categorically states that she has no intention of stopping her visits upstairs, despite her father's pleas. To her, staying below would be a sign of distrust toward Peter, and she is determined to prove to him that she believes in his goodness and strength. She is convinced that their love and friendship are not an obstacle, but the only escape from the depressive daily life of the annex. At this moment in her life, Anne chooses to follow her heart, believing that her own sense of justice and loyalty to Peter is more important than the caution of adults. She is ready to take the risk to preserve the only source of true happiness she has found amidst the war. The atmosphere in the secret annex has shifted from a focus on romance to a period of deep philosophical questioning and familial tension. Outside, the war remains in a frustrating stalemate, though Anne finds herself pondering the greater mysteries of human nature. She wonders why millions are spent on destruction, while art, healthcare, and the poor are neglected, concluding that the guilt of war lies not just with politicians, but with a fundamental destructive urge within every human being. Despite the worsening conditions, the loss of Peter's beloved cat, Boffy, and a watery porridge consisting of rotten lettuce and watery porridge, Anne refuses to succumb to despair. She views her life in hiding as a romantic adventure, a trial that is forging her into a strong, independent woman who will never be a mere housewife. This burgeoning independence has sparked a sharp conflict with her father. Otto Frank expressed his disappointment that Anne continued her nightly visits to Peter despite his warnings, using words that Anne found patronizing and offensive. Emboldened by a sense of victory over her past loneliness, Anne drafted a letter to him that serves as a manifesto of her maturity. She argues that since July 1942, she has fought a silent, tearful battle to become independent of her parents' emotional support. She reminds him that when she was struggling, the adults only criticized her noise and shrewishness, failing to see the comedy she was playing to hide her inner pain. Now she declares herself spiritually and physically independent, no longer a child but an adult shaped by hardship. Anne's ultimatum to her father is clear. He must either forbid her visits entirely or trust her judgment as an equal. She refuses to be treated like a typical 14-year-old, asserting that her experiences have aged her far beyond her years. While she still values her father, she no longer feels accountable to him for her actions, believing that she alone is responsible for her choices. This defiance is not born of spite, but of a desperate need to protect the only source of comfort she has found in the annex. She is determined to walk her own path, fueled by a cheerfulness and endurance that she believes will see her through the end of the war.
The arrogance of Anne's defiant manifesto quickly crumbled under the weight of a reality she hadn't anticipated: the immense capacity for hurt in someone who loves her. After slipping the letter into her father's pocket, she spent the evening in a state of nervous expectation, only to learn from Margot that Pym was deeply shaken and confused. Outside, the world continued its descent into chaos. Anne notes the staggering black market prices, hundreds of guilders for a bit of tea or coffee, and a society where even funeral directors trade in cheese to survive. Amsterdam has become a place of disappearances and desperation, but the most significant battle for Anne was the one taking place within the quiet confines of her own heart. The fallout of the letter resulted in a long, tearful confrontation that shattered Anne's self-righteousness. Her father, usually so gentle, spoke with a directness that cut through her pride. He described her letter as the ugliest he had ever received, expressing his heartbreak that a child so shielded by parental love could claim she felt no responsibility towards them. Anne realized with a jolt of shame that in her attempt to prove she was a grown woman, she had acted with a profound, childish cruelty. She had wanted to force her father to respect her maturity, but instead, she had deeply wounded the one person who had been her constant support. The most humbling part of the ordeal for Anne was her father's immediate and total forgiveness. By promising to burn the letter and treating her with renewed kindness, he shamed her far more than anger ever could. Anne reflects that she had elevated herself to unreachable heights of vanity, imagining herself superior to her parents, only to realize that she still has everything to learn about character. She admits that much of her earlier despair was a pose, a dramatic role she played for herself, and she now sees that causing intentional pain is the lowest thing a person can do. This crisis has led to a vow of self-reformation. Anne has resolved to stop looking down on others and to begin the difficult work of re-educating herself. She finds comfort in the fact that she no longer faces this task alone. With Peter's love and the anchor of her books and writing, she believes she has the tools to build a truly good character. She is determined to use her father as her example, moving forward with a sense of humility. She has learned that true independence is not found in defiance, but in the responsibility one holds towards those they love. After the emotional storm of her letter and the subsequent reconciliation with her father, Anne's thoughts have turned toward the past and the startling contrast between her family's history and their current reality. She reflects on her family lineage, revealing that her father grew up as the quintessential rich man's son, surrounded by balls, grand parties, and the luxury of high society life in Germany before the First World War and inflation swept their fortune away. Her mother's family, too, was wealthy, with stories of engagements attended by hundreds of guests. The irony is not lost on Anne as she watches her refined 55-year-old father, a man once destined for high finance, scraping the very bottom of a pan for a few last morsels of food. This legacy of lost wealth fuels Anne's own ambitions. Unlike Margot, who dreams of a selfless life as a midwife in Palestine, or her mother, who yearns for a modest domestic stability, Anne admits she is not attracted to a petite bourgeois existence. She dreams of traveling to London or Paris to study art history, wearing beautiful clothes and moving among fascinating people. She possesses a hunger for life that extends beyond survival. She wants to experience everything the world has to offer, and she honestly admits that she wouldn't mind having a bit of money to help her achieve it. The stark reality of their current hunger was brought into sharp focus by a visit from Miep, who described a high society engagement party she recently attended. To the inhabitants of the annex, Miep's description of vegetable soup, sandwiches, roasted meat, and wine sounded like a fairy tale. They crowded around her, hanging on every word as if they had never heard of fine food before. Anne finds it absurd and tragic that the granddaughters of millionaires are now reduced to eating half-raw spinach and rotten potatoes just to stay alive. They joke about becoming as strong as Popeye from their constant spinach diet, but the truth is, their stomachs are constantly growling. Despite the hunger and the envy provoked by Meep's stories, Anne finds comfort in the small details of the outside world. She notes with interest that Meep, even while enjoying herself, kept a sharp eye out for potential allies, noting the names of sympathetic policemen at the party who might be of help in the future. For Anne, these stories are more than just gossip. They are a bridge to a future she is determined to reach. She refuses to let the annex diminish her spirit, holding on to her dreams of glamour and intellectual pursuit as firmly as she holds on to her diary.
Even within the claustrophobic walls of the annex, life continues to offer unexpected moments of comedy and domestic challenge. Anne has finished her fairy tale about Ellen the Fairy, a beautifully crafted manuscript decorated with red ink, which she considers a potential birthday gift for her father. Meanwhile, the residents face a new threat from the outside world. A former employee intends to drink her coffee in the office every afternoon. This implies hours of total stillness, a ban on using the toilet, and blocked access to food supplies. The suggestions for handling the situation range from practical to absurd. Mr. Van Dan's idea to slip a laxative into the visitor's coffee sparked a wave of laughter and light-hearted jokes that momentarily brightened the heavy atmosphere. One of the most amusing, albeit unpleasant, incidents Anne describes takes place in the attic involving Maushi the cat. Because her litter box was wet, she decided to seek an alternative spot on a pile of wood shavings. The result was a minor catastrophe. The liquid leaked through the ceiling, passed through the barrel of potatoes, and began dripping into the dining room directly onto the table, landing between a pile of socks and some books. The sight of Peter trying to clean up with powder and water while Mr. Van Daan struggled with the aftermath moved Anne to tears of laughter. Despite the fragrant conclusion to the day, she sympathized with the poor animal, who wasn't to blame for the shortage of proper materials. Against the backdrop of these small domestic dramas, the voice of freedom reaches them via the radio. Queen Wilhelmina addressed her people with words of approaching liberation and heroism, preparing for her return to the Netherlands. The evening ended with a pastor's prayer for the Jews and for all those suffering in concentration camps and prisons. These words reminded Anne and the others that while they laughed at the cat's mischief, the fates of millions were being decided outside, and their personal story remained part of a larger, collective prayer for salvation. Despite the cramped physical space of the annex, Anne's intellectual world has expanded into a vast, bustling universe of history, science, and mythology. She describes herself as Professor Anne, buried under a mountain of assignments that would intimidate a university student. Her schedule is relentless. She is rushing to finish a biography of Galileo before it must be returned to the library, decoding the complexities of the 7 Years' War, and meticulously organizing the sprawling family trees of Charles V. Her mind has become a tangled ball of yarn, where Greek heroes like Theseus and Hercules compete for space with the sculptures of Phidias and the biblical mysteries of Sodom and Gomorrah. Even her beloved collection of movie star clippings has fallen into a state of crying chaos because she is simply too busy with her academic pursuits. Beneath this academic fervor lies a growing professional ambition. Anne explicitly shares her most heartfelt wish to become a journalist and eventually a famous writer. She is already conceptualizing a book titled The Secret Annex, intending to use her diary as the primary source material for a published work after the liberation. She questions whether this is a thirst for greatness or a mere obsession, but her clarity of purpose is undeniable. She is no longer just writing to pass the time. She is documenting a history she intends to tell the world, seeing her confinement not just as a prison, but as a laboratory for her future career. The heavy atmosphere of work and study was briefly lifted by the celebration of her father's birthday and her parents' 19th wedding anniversary. The day was blessed with radiant sunshine and the sight of the chestnut tree in the yard, which Anne noted was even more beautiful and heavily laden with blossoms than the previous year. The residents managed to pull together a surprising array of gifts: biographies, nature books, and a professionally decorated box from the Van Dans containing eggs, beer, and yogurt. The annex was filled with the scent of Anne's roses and the taste of 50 small pastries, providing a rare moment of exquisite indulgence. For a few hours, the gentlemen had their beer, the ladies had their yogurt, and the grim reality of the war was replaced by the simple, dignified pleasure of a family celebration. Domestic life in the annex has returned to its usual cycle of bickering and small personal dramas. Anne captures a particularly absurd exchange between Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan, which she views with the detached amusement of a spectator at a play. The argument begins with the German Atlantic Wall and quickly devolves into a petty dispute over whose wartime predictions have been more accurate. As Mr. Van Daan storms out, threatening that his wife will one day reap what she has sown, Anne, her mother, and Peter are left struggling to contain their laughter. For Anne, these moments reinforce her belief that adults, for all their lecturing of the young, are often the ones most in need of a proper education in self-control. Physically, the strain of their diet is taking a toll. Anne suffered a bout of illness with vomiting and stomach pains, an experience she finds particularly miserable in their confined quarters. Despite her intense hunger upon recovering, she faces the grim reality of their current rations: more beans. The food periods continue to be a test of endurance, where even the most basic nourishment becomes a source of dread rather than relief. In the quiet of the attic, however, her relationship with Peter remains a source of mutual comfort. She notes that Peter seems even more starved for tenderness than she is, blushing like a child during their nightly goodnight kisses and silently pleading for more. Anne reflects on her role in his life, wondering, half joking, if she is merely a replacement for her lost cat, but ultimately concluding that his happiness in being loved is genuine and profound. Yet Anne reveals a strategic shift in her own emotional landscape. Following her hard-won victory of independence and the recent conflict with her father, she has consciously chosen to protect her inner self once more. While she still cares for Peter, she describes her soul as being behind a locked door again. She is no longer the vulnerable, weeping girl of a few weeks ago. If Peter, or anyone else, wants to truly reach her deepest thoughts now, she notes that they will need a much stronger iron crowbar to break the lock she has placed on her heart. Domestic life in the annex has a way of turning small accidents into major dramas. Anne recently returned from the attic to find a scene of minor catastrophe. A vase of carnations had toppled over, drenching her precious papers. Her immediate reaction was of theatrical despair. She bemoaned the irreparable damage to her meticulously drawn genealogical trees and notebooks, much to the amusement of her father, mother, and Margot, who couldn't help but laugh at her dramatic vocabulary. However, once the initial shock wore off, Anne's practical side took over. She spent the evening in the attic carefully peeling apart the sodden pages and hanging them up to dry on the clothesline. The result was a surreal historical gallery: Maria de Medici pinned up next to Charles V and William of Orange beside Marie Antoinette. Mr. Van Daan couldn't resist joking that such a mixture of royal lines hanging together was a racial scandal. After entrusting Peter with the task of watching over her drying ancestors, Anne returned downstairs to assess her schoolbooks. While most of her work was salvageable, Anne found one particular disappointment in the wreckage. Her algebra book remained perfectly dry. She confesses a deep, visceral hatred for the subject, wishing the book had fallen directly into the water and been destroyed. The textbook is a weathered, yellowed villain, scrawled with 20 girls who owned it before her. For Anne, the survival of the algebra book is the only true tragedy of the evening, and she half-seriously contemplates tearing the damned thing apart herself. The atmosphere in the annex has shifted from domestic trifles to a heavy, brooding contemplation of the future. The much-anticipated Second Front remains a phantom, causing the residents, and indeed all of Western Europe, to fluctuate between desperate hope and cynical doubt. Anne observes that while many good Dutch citizens are losing faith in the British, blaming them for the delay, they forget that every nation, including the Netherlands, played a role in the ostrich policy that allowed Germany to arm itself. She realistically notes that no country will sacrifice its sons solely for the interests of another. Liberation will come on the Allies' timeline, not when the occupied lands demand it. However, a far more painful realization has reached the hidden family. Anne writes with deep sorrow about a rising tide of anti-Semitism among the Dutch population, even within circles where it never previously existed. Reports suggest that Christians are blaming Jews for the harsh punishments meted out to those who helped them, or for breaking under German interrogation. Anne's response is a powerful defense of shared humanity. She asks if any person, Christian or Jew, could truly withstand the brutal interrogation methods of the Gestapo. She is heartbroken by the recurring injustice that while a Christian is judged as an individual, an entire people is held responsible for the actions of a single Jew. The most devastating blow is the rumor that German Jews who fled to the Netherlands will not be allowed to stay after the war, but will be sent back to Germany. Anne questions the very purpose of the war if the struggle for truth and justice does not apply equally to everyone. She grapples with the irony of loving a country that she fears may turn her back on her once the danger has passed. To Anne, who considers herself stateless but dreams of becoming a Dutch citizen, the thought of having to pick up her small bundle of belongings and leave the land she loves is a source of profound grief. Despite this bitterness, Anne refuses to let go of her ideals. She clings to the hope that this hatred is only a temporary symptom of the war's misery and that the Dutch people will eventually regain their sense of fairness. She wants to believe in a world where her identity as a Jew does not preclude her from having a homeland. Her writing here reflects a significant maturation. She is no longer just a girl describing her surroundings, but a young woman grappling with the complex political and moral failings of the world at large.
Life in the Secret Annex has been shaken by a painful new wave of insecurity. The arrest of their trusted greengrocer, who was caught hiding 2 Jews in his own home, is a devastating blow that Anne describes with genuine despair. She sees this as further proof of a topsy-turvy world where honorable people are sent to concentration camps while scum rules over the young and old. This tragedy also has immediate practical consequences for the residents. Their food supply has become nearly impossible to maintain. Anne details their new survival regime: no breakfast, bread porridge for lunch, and only baked potatoes for dinner. For her, starvation is more bearable than the thought of being discovered. The tension is exacerbated by domestic hardships. The sewage system is blocked, turning every basic necessity into a source of fear and enforced silence. Anne feels more broken than she has been in months, torn between 2 vastly different worlds. On one side are the arrests, the Jewish question, and hunger. On the other are the stories from their helpers about engagements, cabarets, and cakes. She notes with bitterness the vast difference between themselves and their rescuers. While Miep and Crawler can momentarily forget the annex and live their ordinary lives, for those trapped inside, the pressure has been constant and unbearable for nearly 2 years. This period marks a profound spiritual crisis for Anne. She admits that for the first time in months, she feels utterly miserable and terrified. Even Peter's presence no longer brings the same solace. She feels a growing disappointment in him, and the fear of a sudden police raid paralyzes her. Simply going downstairs to the toilet alone at night becomes a grueling test of courage amidst the mysterious creaks of the large, silent house.
In moments of total exhaustion, she even questioned whether it would have been better if they hadn't gone into hiding at all, rather than living in this eternal unease and endangering their helpers. Despite these dark thoughts, Anne's instinct for life remains stronger. She confesses that although they are weary of waiting, they still love life and hope for the voice of nature. In her desperation, she yearns for an end to this uncertainty, even if that end is heavy or comes in the form of gunfire, just to stop the agonizing anticipation. Let the end come, she writes, seeking the clarity of knowing whether they will ultimately win or perish. The month of May closes with an unbearable heatwave that turns the secret annex into a stifling oven. Anne ironically details the residents' endless complaints, from the melting butter and spoiled milk to Mrs. Van Dan's refusal to wash dishes in the sweltering temperature. Even in these extreme conditions, the petty dramas do not cease. A new dispute erupts over the distribution of butter, and Dussel begins a strange flirtish rapport with Mrs. Van Dan, which Anne observes with open mockery. Despite the dwindling rations of potatoes and the poor weather, momentous news begins to pour in over the radio. Rome has been taken by the Fifth Army, and the French coast is being subjected to fierce bombardments. June 6, 1944, becomes the most significant day since the beginning of their time in hiding. This is D-Day, the British radio announces, and the news of the opening of the Second Front surges through the annex. Anne meticulously records the chronology of events: General Eisenhower's speech, the 11,000 planes flying over France, and the Allied troops landing between Cherbourg and Le Havre. The excitement is indescribable. Hope, which for so long had seemed like a mere fairy tale, suddenly takes on a tangible form. Margot begins to dream that by September or October, Anne might be able to return to school. This moment of triumph breathes new courage into Anne. She understands that the hardest part of the struggle may still lie ahead, and that now more than ever they must grit their teeth and remain calm. The thought that friends are on the march and that the end of Nazi oppression is near gives her the strength to endure any future hardship. After 2 years in the dark, 1944 finally promises to be the year of total victory and freedom. The tide of the war has finally turned, and the mood in the secret annex is buoyed by the steady progress of the Allied forces. Anne reports with excitement that the Allies have captured Bayeux and are fighting fiercely for Caen, aiming to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula. She follows the radio reports closely, moved by the stories of courage from wounded soldiers and military correspondents. One detail particularly captures her imagination: the news that Winston Churchill wanted to join the landings personally. Anne is struck by the bravery of the old man, nearly 70 years old, and finds his fearlessness enviable. While the initial frenzy of D-Day has settled into a quiet hum of anticipation, the hope that the war will end by the close of the year has become a lifeline for everyone in hiding. Amidst this global upheaval, Anne reached a personal milestone, her 15th birthday. Despite the constraints of their life, the residents and helpers managed to make the day special. Her parents gifted her a 5-volume set on art history and practical items like undergarments and jam, while Margot gave her a gold bracelet. The helpers, Meep, Bep, and Crawler, brought sweets, notebooks, and even 3 pieces of full cream cheese. However, it was Peter's gift, a beautiful bouquet of roses, that likely touched her most, knowing how difficult it was for him to arrange such a gesture. Now 15, Anne feels the weight of her dual identity more than ever: a student of history and art, a young woman in love, and a witness to the greatest conflict in human history. Even as she celebrates, Anne remains sharp-tongued and critical of the adults around her. She expresses frustration with Mrs. Van Dan, who has shifted from complaining about the lack of a second front to grumbling incessantly about the rainy weather. Anne directs her ire toward those outside who continue to criticize the British as cowards or old men, while simultaneously hating the Germans. To Anne, these people lack a clear understanding of the monumental effort being made for their liberation. As the storms and rains lash against the French coast, Anne watches the rear annex fortifications with a renewed sense of courage, drawing strength from the knowledge that finally the world is moving toward her rescue. As the war outside intensifies, the war within Anne Frank continues with equal fervor. Now 15, she reflects on the recurring accusations from the adults that she is arrogant and modest lacking. With sharp intellectual honesty, she admits that she is her own harshest critic, constantly judging her own faults far more severely than anyone else. She identifies the hypocrisy in Mrs. Van Daan's criticisms, noting that the older woman labels Anne as presumptuous only because she cannot bear to see someone more intelligent or self-aware than herself. However, Anne recognizes that there is no smoke without fire and confesses to her own stubborn nature, which she uses as a shield when her mother's advice becomes an overwhelming mountain of moralizing. Deep down, Anne reveals a profound loneliness, a desperate hunger for a confidant who can take her inner struggles to heart and offer comfort. She realizes that the "nobody understands me" sentiment, while perhaps cliché, contains a kernel of painful truth. This leads her to re-evaluate her relationship with Peter. While she acknowledges that Peter is kind, patient, and arguably her best friend, she admits a growing disappointment in him. She's troubled by his aversion to religion and his casual table manners, but most of all, she's frustrated by his emotional unavailability. Anne describes Peter as closed in a way that differs from her own complexity. Even though they've spent 2 years together in hiding and frequently discuss the past, present, and future, she feels that something true is still missing from their connection. She believes that even the most reserved people have moments when they crave total vulnerability, yet Peter continues to hide his innermost thoughts from her. Despite her longing to be near him, which resurfaces powerfully if she stays away for even 2 days, she's beginning to see that while Peter provides a sense of security, he may not be the soulmate capable of truly understanding the depths of her character. Anne is undergoing a profound spiritual awakening where nature has become her only true sanctuary. She reflects with surprise on how things she once took for granted, the blue sky, chirping birds, or moonlight, have become objects of an almost painful longing. She describes moments of selfless bravery where she is willing to risk everything just to stand before an open window to feel the wind or glimpse the racing clouds. For her, nature is more potent than any medicine. It makes her humble and grants her the courage to accept the blows of fate. The tragedy of her situation, however, lies in the fact that she is destined to view the world only through dusty windows and dirty curtains, knowing that nature is the one thing that can never be replaced. While Anne's inner world strives toward the eternal and the beautiful, daily life in the annex remains oppressive and filled with pettiness. Mrs. Van Daan has fallen into another crisis, cycling through a spectrum of emotions, from threats of suicide and hysterical jealousy over Peter's closeness with Anne to complaints about money and her failed flirts with Dussel. Anne observes these scenes with growing disdain, labeling the woman a stupid, whimpering specimen, and concluding that the only way to survive this environment is to laugh at everything and seek consolation solely within herself. The outside world, however, continues to signal its cruelty. Mr. Crawler has received a summons for forced labor, and Mr. Coophouse's health is deteriorating, necessitating surgery. To make matters worse, all private telephone lines in Amsterdam have been cut, further intensifying the sense of isolation and uncertainty. Despite this, Anne remains focused on her inner fortress, attempting to maintain the calm that the sky and stars granted her in her rare moments of contemplation. The atmosphere in the annex has shifted from the heavy, suffocating heat of May to a state of high-voltage optimism.
Anne reports that the tide of the war is turning with a speed that has left the residents jubilant. With the fall of Cherbourg, Vitebsk, and Slobin, the Allies have secured a vital port on the Cotentin Peninsula just 3 weeks after D-Day. Anne mocks the German wonder weapons, the buzzing V-1 flying bombs, noting that while they cause damage in England, they do little to stop the Bolshevik danger advancing from the east. Even the local collaborators, like the Fatty Mussert, are making empty threats to take up arms, a prospect Anne finds laughable. The practicalities of life in hiding, however, remain a daily struggle of math and moderation. As the potato supply nears its end, the family has decided to count out specific rations for each of the 8 inhabitants, leaving everyone to manage their own hunger. Despite this, the psychological weight of the war feels lighter. Pym and Mr. Van Daan are so confident in the Allied advance that they've placed a bold bet. By October 10th, they will be free. Anne shares this hope, looking toward July 27th as the next milestone to measure their progress toward liberation. In the midst of this military drama, Anne is focusing on her self-improvement. She proudly notes her progress in English, tackling Oscar Wilde's An Ideal Husband with the help of a dictionary. Her intellectual world remains her primary escape from the physical confinement and the bad weather at a stretch. Even the helpers are finding small moments of relief. Bep has changed her hair, and Miep is taking a week of well-deserved leave. For the first time in months, these super optimists in the Annex feel they have solid ground beneath their feet, bolstered by the daily news of thousands of prisoners taken and cities reclaimed. As the liberation grows closer, Anne's focus shifts from the military front to the moral one. She is deeply troubled by a series of conversations with Peter, who has joked that he might become a criminal or a black market speculator after the war. Though he speaks in jest, Anne senses a terrifying lack of character beneath his words. When she asks him why he chooses the path of least resistance, his simple answer, because it's easier, leaves her feeling depressed and disillusioned. To Anne, a life of idleness and easy money is not a life at all. She cannot fathom how anyone could be so quickly tempted by laziness when they have the potential to achieve something meaningful. This realization has fundamentally changed her view of Peter. While she once longed for his companionship, now she feels the heavy burden of his reliance on her. She struggles to find a way to explain to him that the easy path leads to a bottomless pit where there are no friends or beauty. She reflects on the privilege they share: education, a solid upbringing, and the chance to do something great, but insists that happiness is something that must be earned through hard work and doing good. For Anne, work provides satisfaction, while idleness is merely a hollow temptation. Anne's philosophical maturity reaches a new peak in this entry as she explores the concept of faith and self-improvement. She concludes that faith, whether in God or simply in one's own honor, is essential for staying on the right path. She proposes a simple but powerful exercise for humanity. If everyone took a moment each night to review their actions of the day, distinguishing the good from the bad, the world would be a far better place. She believes that this constant process of self-correction is free, accessible to everyone, and ultimately creates a strength that no hardship can break. To Anne, the ultimate shield against the world is a clear conscience, a virtue she fears Peter has yet to discover. In a rare break from the usual tension, the Annex was recently taken over by a chaotic, colorful, and messy domestic invasion. First strawberries, then peas. A local business contact delivered 24 crates of strawberries, dusty and sandy but in incredible abundance. The scene was one of surreal normalcy. Helpers and hiders all gathered in the office kitchen together during broad daylight to wash and jar the fruit. Anne describes the thrill of hearing loud voices and slamming doors, feeling a fleeting, heart-pounding sensation of what it will be like to live in freedom again. However, the underground reality quickly reasserted itself. When the doorbell rang twice, the group froze, following the strict rule to turn off all faucets so the sound of running water wouldn't betray them to the mailman outside.
The strawberry fever lasted for days. They ate strawberries with porridge, on bread, with sand, and with sugar, until the fruit was either consumed or locked away as jam. No sooner had the red era ended than the green era began. The vegetable man delivered nearly 20 pounds of peas. The task of shelling and skinning the pea pods proved to be a grueling test of patience for Anne. While the pods were edible and helped stretch their rations, the process of removing the inner membrane was a tedious, mind-numbing labor. Anne spent hours snapping ends and pulling strings until the world seemed to turn entirely green before her eyes. To keep from dying of boredom, she chattered and joked incessantly, making everyone laugh while she privately reaffirmed a vow: she will never be just a housewife. By the time the work was done, she felt seasick from the monotony, sleeping for hours just to escape the lingering image of green pods. In one of the most profound and mature entries of her diary, Anne reflects on the complexities of youth, identity, and the struggle to maintain one's soul in a crumbling world. Spurred by a book about modern girls, she engages in an intense session of self-analysis. She reveals that she possesses a unique self-consciousness, an ability to watch her own actions as if she were a stranger, judging her every word and deed without prejudice. She embraces the idea that, while parents can offer guidance, the final forming of a person's character lies in their own hands. Despite her confinement, she feels a surge of youthful energy and a refusal to be broken by the blows of fate. Anne also explores her evolving relationships with the men in her life. She speaks with painful honesty about her father, Pim, noting that despite his kindness, he fails to understand her true struggle. By treating her as a child passing through a phase rather than an individual fighting for her own identity, he has caused her to withdraw. She admits she has consciously alienated him to protect her inner peace and her unformed ideals from his well-meaning but detached criticism. Her disappointment extends to Peter as well. She confesses to creating an ideal image of him out of her own desperate need for a confidant. She realizes now that she was the pursuer and that she used physical intimacy to force a friendship that Peter is emotionally unable to fulfill. She sees him now not as a soulmate, but a shy, limited boy whom she has made dependent on her, and she struggles with how to help him stand on his own 2 feet. The entry concludes with one of the most famous and moving passages of her writing. Anne grapples with the difficulty of being young during a time when all idealism is being destroyed. She notes that while adults have firm opinions, the youth see the world showing its ugliest side, with dreams and hopes being crushed by a cruel reality. Yet, in an extraordinary display of resilience, she refuses to give up. Looking at the approaching thunderstorm of war and the misery of millions, she remarkably declares, "I still believe that people are really good at heart." She resolves to hold on to her ideals, believing that peace and tranquility will eventually return, and she must be ready for that day.
The Secret Annex is buzzing with a renewed, electric sense of hope following extraordinary news from the outside world. Anne reports on the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler, noting with sharp irony that it wasn't carried out by the usual Jewish communists or English capitalists, but by a high-ranking young Aryan count. Although Hitler survived with only minor injuries, Anne views the event as a pivotal sign of internal collapse within the German military. She cynically observes that divine providence might have spared Hitler just long enough for the Germans to begin tearing each other apart, thereby making the job easier for the advancing Allies. Anne's writing here is uncharacteristically lighthearted and biting. She mocks Hitler's subsequent decree that any soldier may shoot their superior officer if they suspect them of treason. She imagines a comedic scenario where a common soldier, tired of being yelled at, simply shoots his officer under the guise of loyalty to the Führer. This breakdown of discipline and the palpable fear among German officers gives Anne a sense of sober reality that feels far more encouraging than any abstract ideal. She is so cheerful that she admits her writing is becoming scattered and illogical. In her excitement, she can't help but dream of a normal life again. The prospect of being free is no longer a distant fairy tale. She dares to imagine herself sitting at a school desk by October. She catches herself anticipating events once again, apologizing for the inconsistency of her thoughts. She concludes the entry by acknowledging the complex, shifting nature of her own personality, describing herself with the term that has become one of her most famous self-reflections. She is a bundle of contradictions. In her final, deeply introspective entry, Anne returns to the phrase that haunts her, a bundle of contradictions. She uses this last letter to Kitty to explain the duality of her soul, describing two versions of herself that are constantly at war. The first, Anne number 1, is the girl the world sees, the flamboyant, witty, flirtatious clown who shrugs her shoulders at criticism and makes light of everything. This superficial side acts as a protective shield, but it is also a source of deep frustration, as it often drowns out the second, purer Anne. The purer Anne is a secret that no one in the Annex knows. She is the side that thinks deeply, feels the pain of the world, and strives for moral perfection. Anne confesses that when she does try to let this serious side emerge, she feels incredibly vulnerable, like a mimosa plant that shrivels at the slightest touch. She fears that if she shows her true sentimental self, the people around her will mock her or refuse to take her seriously. Consequently, when she is quiet or serious, her family assumes she is ill and tries to dose her with medicine, which only makes her retreat further into her prickly, sarcastic shell. This internal struggle is exhausting. Anne expresses a profound desire to be the person she knows she could be, the good, quiet Anne, but she finds it impossible as long as she is surrounded by the expectations and judgments of others. She feels trapped in her own reputation as a know-it-all and a flirt, unable to bridge the gap between her boisterous public persona and her silent, noble private self. The diary ends with this poignant admission of loneliness and the hope for a future where she could simply be herself, if only there were no other people in the world. The silence following Anne's final entry is broken by the harsh reality of history. On August 4th, 1944, just 3 days after her last letter to Kitty, the fragile safety of the secret annex was shattered. Following an anonymous tip, the Gestapo stormed the building, arresting all 8 inhabitants along with their brave helpers, Crowler and Koophuis. In the chaos of the raid, the diary, Anne's most precious possession, was scattered across the floor among old books and magazines. It was later rescued by Miep and Bep, who kept it safe, hoping to return it to Anne after the war. Tragically, that reunion never happened. Of the 8 who hid in the annex, only Anne's father, Otto Frank, survived the horrors of the concentration camps. Anne herself succumbed to typhus at Bergen-Belsen in March 1945, a mere 2 months before the liberation of the Netherlands, and just weeks before the camp itself was liberated. Her sister Margot perished shortly before her. Though her life was cut short at 15, the publication of her diary fulfilled her deepest wish, to live on even after her death and to become a writer who touched the world. Today, the building at Prinsenkrant 263 stands as a global monument managed by the Anne Frank Foundation. While the secret annex remains preserved in its original stark state to honor those who suffered there, the rest of the site has been transformed into an international youth center. It serves not only as a place of remembrance, but a living catalyst for the ideals Anne cherished. In the spirit of her final entries, the center encourages young people to work for a better society, ensuring that while the voice of the boisterous Anne was silenced by hate, the voice of the purer Anne continues to inspire hope and humanity in every generation that follows. As we close the final pages of Anne's diary, we're left not just with the weight of history, but with the enduring power of a young girl's voice. Anne's journey from a spirited child to a profound philosopher reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can remain unbroken. This concludes our detailed retelling of the Diary of a Young Girl. We hope this journey has brought you closer to Anne's world and the timeless lessons she left behind. If this series has moved you or expanded your understanding, every like and subscribe truly helps us develop and continue bringing these important stories to life. Your support is the fuel that keeps this channel growing. But more importantly, we want to hear from you. What part of Anne's story resonated with you the most? Do you still believe, as she did, that people are truly good at heart? Please don't hesitate to leave a comment below with your thoughts and reflections. Let's keep the conversation and Anne's legacy alive. Thank you for listening, and keep learning.